There's a difference between feeling better and actually getting better. Sometimes we have to endure tolerate discomfort in order to get better longer term. But we are constantly duped by going for the easy option. The most ingrained, fundamental, primitive, and world's most popular coping strategy is avoidance.
I kind of feel like I'm guilty of a lot of what you've been saying. What should I do instead? Welcome back to the Everyday Stoic with myself, William Mulligan. I believe we all deserve to flourish and to become the best version of ourselves, for ourselves, for our loved ones, and for the people around us. And I think the path there is by listening to people that understand how to flourish, people who have already taken that journey, either through using ancient practices, refined over thousands of years, or through using new principles that they have taught or learned through modern day principles and practices. So join me, William Mulligan, on the Everyday Stoic podcast. And today I'm joined with Donald Robertson for a 3-hour talk. Donald is, I think, the leading expert on Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius. He wrote many books on Stoicism, like The Art of Happiness, Build Your Resilience, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor. So Donald has so much knowledge on Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, on Socrates, but also through his professional practice as a CBT practitioner and as someone that trains therapists. His knowledge is amazing for practical advice. And I think this is the first time I've spoke to someone where I felt like I was on this level, on this range of my knowledge, where I thought I was quite not intelligent, but I thought I was doing well. And I felt like he was on another tier, which he didn't belittle me or make me feel this way. I just could understand that his knowledge was at a very high level. And I think that's what we need for the best advice is people like him. Today's episode is powered by Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. I love Huel. Huel is delicious. It's very quick to set up. It's very practical when I'm busy on the go, if I'm writing, if I'm working out, if I'm in a hurry, if I'm looking after my daughter, I can hold her in one hand, set up the Huel with the other hand, and it's delicious food and it's healthy, more importantly. It saves me from going to the shops and buying junk, wasting loads of money. So if you have any interest in Huel products, click the link in the description. And my book, The Everyday Stoic Simple Rules for a Good Life, is now available for order. And thank you to everyone buying it, sharing it, and leaving reviews. It means a great deal. Enjoy today's talk. Today, I was going to talk about how Aurelius can help the average person or help anyone with worry and anxiety. I'm curious to know why you think Aurelius is a figure that we can look towards to help us in worry and anxiety.
Well, for many reasons. Gosh, what's a good place to begin? Some of the reasons that I would give might seem a little bit surprising to people. Let me say this first of all. So I'll explain my background. My first degree is in philosophy. My master's degree is in the integration of philosophy and psychotherapy, interdisciplinary centre at Sheffield University where I studied. And so my whole career was about really combining philosophy and psychotherapy. And the psychotherapy that I'm most associated with, although I trained in many different modalities and worked in different contexts, is cognitive behavioural psychotherapy, which is originally inspired, as it happens, by Stoic philosophy. And cognitive behavioural therapy is an evidence-based psychotherapy. Now, there's one very striking, if you're very interested in evidence-based practice, there's an obvious problem with cognitive behavioral psychotherapy or any psychotherapy, which is that it is a therapy. The very fact that it's a therapy raises questions, because a therapy is something that you do when somebody already has a problem. So in an ideal world, they wouldn't have the problem to begin with. So you would be doing prevention rather than therapy. And so research on prevention in psychotherapy exists and has for decades, but it's still kind of in its infancy. We tend to call it emotional resilience building when we train people preventatively based on what we know about psychotherapy. So, for example, there's the best known approach is called the Penn Resilience Program, and it's developed by Martin Seligman and his colleagues at Pennsylvania. And variations of it are used with the military. Sometimes it's used with school children. And one way of measuring its effectiveness is long-term looking at the number of people that develop symptoms of anxiety or depression. Now, it works. In a way, it's not surprising that it works because it's based on what we know works already in clinical practice therapeutically or remedially. So you'd think some variation of that should work preventatively. But it's not as sticky as we'd like. So it seems that you have to do booster sessions every couple of years or so. And that's also not surprising because cognitive behavioral therapy, to some extent, is skills-based, particularly the behavioral part of it. And when you teach human beings skills, or really any animal learns skills, often they use them for a while and then stop using them. Like, unless you create some kind of mechanism or framework that continually reinforces the behavior and keeps it in place. So it's an obvious problem in a way. So why would Marcus Aurelius be able to help people? Because first of all, it's striking that people that get into Stoicism tend to stay into Stoicism. So Stoicism is a good example of something that psychologists sometimes call sticky. Like Stoicism is sticky. Like it's very sticky.
Yeah.
It's like yoga or Buddhism. People treat it almost like a religion. They identify with it at a high level cognitively. So it's not just a thing they do, it's something they become. They think of themselves as being a Stoic. It's a role that they identify with often. And some people don't like that idea, but actually in some ways it's a good thing because it tends to lend itself to the longevity of the change that can be brought about. And we don't get that with CBT. People don't become a CBT client permanently. Like CBT is meant to be time limited, but people become a Buddhist, they become a Stoic, or, they identify with it. And it's that identification with it that's the holy grail of prevention, really. So really, one of the reasons people are interested in Stoicism, it holds out this hope that's yet to be properly tested, that it might be something that resembles CBT, but is permanent, or long-lasting in a way that CBT isn't always. And that would be incredibly valuable. Now, why would it have that? Why would Marcus Aurelius have that? I'll make another odd observation about this. We have less than 1% of Stoic literature surviving today. We don't really have very much except fragments from the founders of Stoicism, even though Chrysippus, the most prolific of the early Stoics, supposedly wrote over 700 texts or books. We just have little quotes and fragments. Our main sources are Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, who all are Johnny-come-latelys. They are living under the Roman Empire. To them, Zeno was ancient history. Like Zeno founded the Stoic school nearly 500 years before Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations. That would be like you writing about someone in the late medieval period.
Yeah.
So it's old by the time we get to Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And yet Marcus Aurelius, his writings survive. Seneca, for a similar reason, I think, because Seneca was Seneca was really a professional writer, but he was also kind of a rhetoric tutor to Nero of sorts. I say that because he wasn't actually a professor of rhetoric. His father was, but he became a rhetoric tutor. So they were both experts on writing. Marcus Aurelius, many people don't realize this, but Marcus Aurelius was a highly trained rhetorician in Latin and Greek. He trained under the leading rhetoricians of his era for many, many, many years. And it's no coincidence that their texts survive because ironically, because of rhetoric, because they're exceptionally beautifully and clearly written. And they're both masters of formulating aphorisms. So they're both highly quotable, and that's led to their longevity. So the point I'm making is, ironically, people can benefit from Marcus Aurelius. If I give you a best-selling book on CBT and you read it, I don't think you're going to reread it every year for the rest of your life. I doubt that 10 years later you'd still be able to remember a selection of quotes from that book. Maybe remember some, but I doubt it. I don't think you're going to go out and get a tattoo of a quote from a book on CBT, like Feeling Good by David Burns or something like that. I've never heard of anyone doing that. But people get Stoic quotes tattooed on them. They memorize the quotes. They reread the books over and over again. And it's partly because of the profound nature of the content. It's philosophy that's been distilled over 500 years. Marcus Aurelius isn't making these ideas up. He's condensing ideas that have evolved over 500 years through the hands of many, many preceding philosophers. And he's trained himself for many, many years to very carefully, with meticulous detail, formulate those ideas using the most evocative and memorable imagery that he can come up with. It's not a chance that his book survived and other books don't. It's because it's exceptionally well written, in a sense, and highly memorable. It's designed to be so. And I think that can benefit us because it gives us techniques, ideas, and a guide to life that resonate at a much deeper level than CBT, but are broadly consistent with what research tells us today about how our emotions work.
Yeah, well, certainly with Marcus Aurelius, he was my introduction to Stoicism before I even knew what Stoicism was. So I was identifying with this emperor and kind of following in his footsteps, trying to become like him. And I didn't know that it was a philosophy. I didn't know anything. I was just, like you say, it's very highly quotable. And yeah, you can sort of identify with even just one quote. Like the first quote I ever remember was about being like the rock as the waves crash over. And I kind of misinterpreted it when I first read it. And that was my introduction to Stoicism. I wanted to be this like rock in like a shaky world. But then it was a very good introduction into this vast philosophy. But going into Aurelius's character, him as an actual person, if he was to kind of stand in front of me, why do you think him as a person can lecture me on how to stop worrying?
Well, just as an aside, there's actually a section, it's book 11, passage 18, funnily enough, it's one of my favorite passages, where he specifically says that he doesn't think he should lecture anybody on how they should live their life. It's funny, it's a really odd, it's one of the many most intriguing passages, because he talks about giving advice to someone that he refers to as my son. Now, he uses that as a figure of speech, but we don't know. He could be talking about Commodus, possibly. Mm-hmm. It's not impossible. He would have been like a teenager, perhaps, at the time. Or he might just be using it as a figure of speech. But he says, listen, my son, and he imagines himself giving someone advice, but he says, don't do it like a schoolmaster. Don't do it like you're lecturing them, but it should be done with kindness and empathy and compassion, like you're genuinely trying to help them. And he thinks you should model like the things that you want to teach other people. So, he says, first and foremost, I have to embody, these things. Otherwise, what's the point in trying to tell someone else? But then what he tells them is basically just the same Stoic principles that he's been studying himself, essentially. Why would he be a good person? In a sense, Marcus Aurelius he would say himself, is just an ordinary man. The reason I've written 3 books about him in a row. So the reason that I've written these books, partly because the publisher asked me to, but because I wanted to write an introduction to Stoicism that focused on a kind of historical role model. And I thought, first of all, of Zeno. But then I thought, we don't have enough stories about Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, to fill a book. And then I thought, well, he's the first famous Stoic. Who's the last famous Stoic? Marcus Aurelius. And we know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do not only about any other Stoic, but we may know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do, arguably, about any other ancient philosopher. For the simple reason, a lot of ancient philosophers, we don't even know what they look like. we have very negligible details about their lives. We know very little about Epictetus, for example. We'd have no depictions of what he looks like. We thought we knew what Seneca looked like, and then we discovered we were wrong. There's a bust of Seneca that has his name engraved on it now, and we realize he's this kind of jowly, balding, senatorial kind of like figure that's not, what people had previously imagined he looked like. But Marcus Aurelius, for instance, we have many statues of depicting him at different stages. We have him as a young boy. We have him approaching 60, looking pretty haggard in statues. We have his personal reflections and meditations. We have a cache of his private letters. We have 3 histories of his reign. We have references to him by many other authors. We have a record to some extent of his legal rescripts, so we can kind of infer things about his legal or political agenda from that. We have inscriptions on medallions and coins and sculpture. Of course, because he was an emperor, we've got all this evidence we can construct. And not only that, he also, another way that you can understand a historical figure is if you know their mates, as it were. So it's hard to write a biography of somebody if you don't know anything about the place where they lived or the people that surround them. But if you know a lot about the city of Rome in the time of Marcus Aurelius, if you know a lot about the people against whom he was fighting wars, if you know about other famous individuals that lived during his lifetime that he had contact with, then that helps to provide a lot of valuable context for understanding Marcus Aurelius's life. I mean, for instance, we know a lot about the Emperor Hadrian, and he was Marcus's adoptive grandfather. So one way of trying to kind of understand more about Marcus is to look at his relationship with Hadrian quite closely, and that, because then we have both sides, as it were, and it can be quite revealing that our knowledge of Hadrian can help us fill in some gaps. So first of all, we know a lot about Marcus. And that's why he's useful as a kind of role model. That's why I chose to focus on him. But he's also someone, I think, who works as a good role model. And then this is maybe a general point about the Stoics as well. This seems like a bit of a digression. Let me tell you a story. Most of the ancient schools of philosophy are named after their founder. So we speak of Platonism, Aristotelianism, Pythagoreanism, Epicureanism, generally. Like some of these schools have other names, but we often refer to them. Particularly Epicureanism is very much associated with its founder. They celebrated his birthday. They carried around images of Epicurus. They memorized his words verbatim. He was treated as a semi-divine figure by his followers for centuries and centuries afterwards. Stoicism was founded by Zeno, and it is not called Zenonianism. It was called something like that briefly, we're told. And then the Stoics early on decided that they would name it after the Stoa Poikile, which is the place where they met. And I think that's an important decision. They decided it was not going to be a cult of personality. And they decided that because the Stoics do not believe that anyone is perfectly wise. They believe there's a hypothetical ideal of the sophos, or ideal sage, but that basically no real human being has ever embodied perfect virtue. And so everyone has to think for themselves. You cannot just memorize what somebody else said. That would go against their philosophy. And really, it would conflict also with what Socrates taught and represented, I think. And Socrates is kind of the godfather of Stoicism in many ways. He's their main role model. So the Stoics didn't think they were perfect, and they wanted to view themselves more as a kind of peer support group almost. Seneca describes this really well in the letters to Lucilius. He says, "Don't approach me like you're a patient and I'm a physician, like an expert. Think of it rather as if we're both patients and I've just been undergoing treatment for longer than you have, so I can kind of talk about how it's been going for me." And that sounds like Alcoholics Anonymous or something. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a peer support therapy group or something of that nature. I think Zeno might have said something similar. It sounds to me like this Seneca is just reiterating a position that runs through the whole of Stoicism, that even the founders of Stoicism weren't perceived as experts or gurus, that they were perceived as fallible. And so the emphasis is on every individual having to think for themselves and test beliefs out. So Marcus Aurelius, like other Stoics in this regard, is not presenting himself as a guru or an infallible sage. There are many references in the Meditations to his weakness and fallibility, his frustration with himself. Psychologically, that's important. There's a piece of modern research that's well known to, a body of research that's well known to most modern psychotherapists. But it's worth dwelling on for a moment because it's something that confuses many people in the self-improvement field. So people in the self-improvement field for many years have talked about mastery modeling. And that's the idea that you look at somebody who's exceptionally good at something and you emulate the behavior. And the irony about that is that any evidence-based clinician or researcher would be able to tell you that the research shows that that's not, generally speaking, a good idea. There are two types of modeling that we usually distinguish. We call them mastery modeling and coping modeling. And mastery modeling plays a role, but generally coping modeling is more effective psychologically for a number of reasons. And coping modeling, I'll give you an example. If you wanted, I specialized in treating with people with social anxiety disorder and as a therapist and other anxiety disorders. But some people with social anxiety typically have perfectionistic standards that they apply to themselves and other people. And so it's characteristic of them that they would fixate on wanting to emulate someone that they think is a highly accomplished public speaker, say Tony Robbins or somebody like that. They think, I really want to be like Tony Robbins, and I try and copy him and stuff like that. And often that leads to frustration because social anxiety is about being overly preoccupied with your own mistakes or perceived flaws, and comparing yourself to somebody who you perceive as flawless or highly accomplished just tends to highlight your own shortcomings. And it also doesn't tell you how to get to that level of being polished and confident. It shows you the destination, but it doesn't show you the route that you have to follow to get from where you currently are at the moment to there. So people with social anxiety would be much better to look at other people who have social anxiety and have been making progress in overcoming it and understanding how they cope or recover when they experience a bout of anxiety, right? Rather than looking at somebody who maybe doesn't experience much anxiety because they've been doing this for decades, so it's not, they don't really have any obstacles to overcome anymore. If you want to be good at something, don't ask someone who's naturally good at it. Mm-hmm. Ask someone who's naturally rubbish at it and has had to put a lot of effort into becoming better at it. Because they'll be able to tell you what the techniques and strategies and practices and exercises are that they had to use in order to get better. That's what we get from Marcus Aurelius. Right? Marcus Aurelius could be a guy who's like a robot who just says, I'm not scared of dying. I never succumb to temptation. I don't care what other people think of me. There are people like that, right? But no, he's clearly, I would say, quite a sensitive man. There are several references to him crying in public. He mentions that he's concerned about losing his temper. He's concerned about his sexual desire. He refers a lot to coping with anger, which kind of implies that maybe that's been an ongoing struggle for him. And so I think we can learn from him because we see him as a human being, as somebody who's fallible, who has some of the same flaws, particularly anger, that we have today, and has successfully made progress in coping with it. So he can kind of explain to us what's worked for him and model coping or model progress rather than kind of modeling this crystalline ideal of perfection that doesn't really tell us much about how to achieve it. I'll say, I've said this many times, but the other thing I'd mention is that Marcus Aurelius, for several reasons, I would say, exhibits in particular a knowledge of therapy techniques for anger that seems to me exceptional and really quite remarkable in terms of its depth its breadth, its systematic nature. I used to train psychotherapists, counselors, life coaches for many years as a living, for a living. And, they would struggle to name 3 or 4 cognitive strategies for dealing with anger, I think, if I asked the class. If we were brainstorming them on a flip chart or something. Marcus Aurelius lists 10 distinct cognitive strategies. And then he returns to that list repeatedly, which kind of suggests that he's memorized it. He knows it by heart. He has a depth of systematic knowledge of coping with anger that goes way beyond what you would need for self-improvement and would really be more indicative of somebody who's a professional psychotherapist or, just has made a point of studying this subject. A client in therapy who has a problem like anger or anxiety doesn't need 10 coping strategies. Usually you give them one coping strategy that works and then maybe add, 1 or 2 additional ones. But you wouldn't teach them 10 distinct coping. So you would only need to have that level of knowledge if you're systematically studying the subject. So I don't know why he knows so much about it. I suspect that one of his tutors was an expert on Stoic psychotherapy, probably Junius Rusticus, his main tutor, because Marcus at the beginning in the Meditations thanks Rusticus for introducing him to therapia, literally for introducing him to Stoic-based therapy. So we can learn from Marcus Aurelius because he knows a lot about Stoic therapeutic techniques that are particularly relevant today, because we know a lot about his personality. So we have a rounded image of him as an individual. And because he happens to be an expert on rhetoric who writes very beautifully in a way that's designed to be evocative and memorable.
Yeah, how would you compare his knowledge on how would you compare it to modern day therapy knowledge? Do you think it is comparable?
Yeah. It's a big question because it's surprising the extent to which Stoic therapy, Marcus is reiterating, I assume, standard Stoic therapy ideas. Chrysippus, for example, again, who was writing nearly 500 years earlier, ancient history to Marcus, wrote an entire book called On Therapeutics, which is lost to us. But Marcus's physician, Galen, who was not a Stoic, who was a smart aleck, who kind of knew about everything, he was a polymath. Galen had read the early Greek Stoic therapeutic texts and refers to them and quotes from them. We have a book that survives today from Galen called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions, which is clearly a book on psychopathology and psychotherapy. For explicitly so. I wish that we had the original Stoic books on psychotherapy.
I'd love that.
Yeah, we only have these kind of references. What we do have is Seneca's On Anger, which actually is pretty much a Stoic psychotherapy text about a specific subject. How does all of that stuff compare to modern psychotherapy? I wrote an entire book answering that question. It was the first book that I wrote. And I guess what I can say is that I identified 18 distinct psychological strategies that are found in the Stoic literature. So not 2 or 3, but 18, that can be compared to things that we do in modern psychotherapy. So, that's why it would take a long time to answer that question. But the most important answer is that the Stoics, it really comes down to the grassroots level. It reminds me of when I was a kid, I was kind of briefly into martial arts and I'd read books by Japanese karate masters and things. And I noticed they'd often say things that were kind of a bit frustrating to a novice. So you want to learn all these different kicks and punches and blocks and whatnot. And you'd read books by some, expert. And he'd say the most important thing is how you stand or how you breathe or something like that. And you'd think, really? I thought you were going to teach me how to do some really cool flying spinning back kick or something like that.
Yeah.
The most important thing is how you stand. But often I think the deeper someone goes into a subject, the more the basics that other people tend to overlook become more important. They're foundational. So for the Stoics, it's the theory of psychopathology that's the basis of absolutely everything. And it's radical. And they inherit it from Socrates, basically. And it's cognitive. And it's summed up in the single most famous quotation from the Stoics. And it's the most famous quotation from the Stoics because Albert Ellis, the pioneer of cognitive therapy, used to teach it to all of his clients, this quote, and all of his students. And he mentions it in, I think, all of his books, or most of his many, many books that he wrote on rational emotive behavior therapy, which is the first form of modern cognitive therapy. And that quote comes from passage 5 of the Enchiridion of Epictetus. And it says it's not things that upset it. People are not upset by things, but by their opinions about them. And Marcus Aurelius quotes that passage from Epictetus and paraphrases it several times. It's a kind of Stoic cliche in a way, but it became a cliche, a maxim, a slogan of cognitive therapy because it sums up the cognitive model of emotion. As an aside, I should say there are many cognitive models of emotions, but we can kind of lump them all together and say, the basic point about them all, the overarching cognitive model of emotion, is that our beliefs shape our emotions. And the point is that they shape them more than most of us normally assume. We typically underestimate the extent, or we typically don't notice the extent to which our beliefs actually shape our emotions and our desires, incidentally. So that's, if Stoicism and cognitive therapy both have the same foundation, they're likely to arrive on that basis at similar conclusions about what therapy would look like. We talk sometimes about the cause and cure in therapy. So if emotions have a cognitive cause, they probably have a cognitive cure, arguably. There's usually some kind of connection between the nature of the cause and the nature of the cure. So, if you have a cognitive cause in psychopathology, you're probably going to have a cognitive therapy, largely. That's what the Stoics had. That's what modern cognitive therapy develops. Modern cognitive therapy does arrive at a number of conclusions that are broadly similar. Not the same, but they're in the same ballpark as things that the ancient Stoics were saying, because they start from the same premise, the same assumption. And it's an assumption. I'll give you a contemporary example just to highlight how important this is. And again, I feel like a karate teacher telling people it's about how you breathe or something like that. Because I know people want techniques. They go, I want you to tell me how to visualize things. And you'll go, no, it's how you stand. It's how you breathe is the starting part. It's more important than anything else, right? Most people have what some authors in the past have called a hydraulic model of emotion, or sometimes psychologists have called this the naive lump model of emotion. So we talk in philosophy about folk psychology. Folk psychology is the psychological set of psychological assumptions that everyone just takes for granted. So we have a psychological theory. You and I and the man on the Clapham omnibus, and the old lady walking down the street make psychological assumptions about how other people's emotions work, how the mind works, what thoughts are, and, of course, many of those assumptions are bonkers, right? Because most of us never really sit and think about them that much. We inherit them willy-nilly from the society that we grew up in. So surprise, surprise, they're pretty kind of cockeyed and inconsistent and, not that well thought through in many cases, right? Now, the big problem, there are many problems with that, but one of the big problems is our folk psychology about the nature of emotion. So people suffer from anxiety, they suffer from anger. Great. What is anger? What is anxiety? I don't know. It's just like a blob of feeling. It builds up inside you, and then it kind of combusts out like a pus-filled boil or something like that. That's kind of roughly how people envisage these things, as if there's a build-up of pressure of some force or some kind of homogenous lump of feeling, right? That's how we talk about anger. That's how we talk about anxiety, as if it resembled, something building up within us, like a fluid or a pressure. I mean, that's so simplistic that when we have to spell it out, it sounds childish and a bit primitive and a bit silly. Like, it sounds like an anthropologist trying to explain the strange theories held by a pre-literate tribe. You know, so they think of anger as if it's this fluid that builds up, and and you'd be like, these people are primitive. Like, and no, that's us, right? That's our society. We think and talk about it. Like, we're all a bunch of idiots. Like, when it comes to understanding our, so the whole field of self-improvement is vitiated, is hamstrung by the fact that none of us have got a clue what an emotion is to begin with. And so that, I said that cause leads to cure. If we've no idea what the cause is and we've got incoherent, mixed up ideas, that's going to lead us to some pretty confused ideas about what the cure would be. For instance, if you believe that anger, anxiety, sadness just kind of well up inside you like a fluid, you might think, well, the way to get rid of it would be like lancing a boil. So venting, get out of your system, right? Have a good cry, get a baseball bat and beat up a cushion to get all your anger out of your system. Like, we call that the abreactive, cathartic, or venting model. That is one of the least effective therapeutic techniques in the history of psychotherapy. The Stoics never mention it, right? Freud kind of popularized this idea, and then he later abandoned it, because even Freud realized that this isn't actually a good technique. If venting your anger purged it like lancing a boil and got it, but it was building up inside you, and then you get it out of the system by expressing it, then, I don't know, Mike Tyson would be the most chilled out guy you could ever meet in your life. Like, people that do aggressive sports would consistently be super chilled out. Like, when in fact, sometimes that might be true, but in some cases it's the opposite. Like, and they're like a coiled spring, because in some cases venting an emotion reinforces the emotion, right?
Yeah, is that like Epictetus says, if you want to get better at talking, talk. If you want to get better at walking, walk. Is that basically...
That would be the opposite of the vent, yeah.
But if you're always venting, you'll get better at venting, and...
That's what the research generally shows, right? I mean, it's a little bit more complex than that, but essentially, the problem is that sometimes if you get a baseball bat, people literally used to do this, right? I'm not making this up, right? So you could probably find videos of people doing it. So they get a cushion or a pillow or whatever, and they hit it with a baseball bat to get all the anger out of the system. Most people, in some cases, research shows, became angrier as a result. In a way, that seems obvious, right? Of course, you're just going to get angrier, right? If you do that. People who wallow in sadness and crying often just become more prone to crying and sadness as a result. That's the rest of the Stoics never recommend venting as a therapeutic technique. Because why don't they? Because they don't think it works, because they've done clinical trials. No, they didn't have that, because they understand what an emotion is. So they understand, for instance, that emotions are multi-component, they're complex. There are voluntary aspects of emotion and there are involuntary aspects of emotion. And you better distinguish them, because if you mix those up, it's going to end up like a dog's breakfast. And there are cognitive aspects to emotion. So Andrew Tate is my favorite modern example of somebody who takes for granted the folk psychology hydraulic model of emotion, right? So, and who also claims to be into Stoicism, right? And yet what he says is the complete opposite of Stoicism, because he doesn't understand or doesn't agree with the cognitive model of emotion. So Andrew Tate says, if you get really angry because you ask a girl out on a date and she rejects you, he thinks it would be natural for you to get angry. And it's kind of the girl's fault, or it's society's fault, or it's feminism's fault that you're angry. Like, it's perfectly natural to feel that way, he thinks, right? And that what you should do is go and vent that anger and channel it into constructive activity by going to the gym or something. Now, I know, and whenever I mention this on the internet, there are people going, that's a great idea. Like, they think it's a really good idea. But if you think of an emotion as a kind of fluid that builds up inside you, and you could sort of channel it like a canal, right? Or something like that. But this is like a kind of primitive model. You might as well worship trees. This is like a pre-literate level of primitive superstitious understanding of how emotions actually work. It's insane. So emotions actually have cognitive components to them, clearly, right? So number one, if you're angry or anxious or depressed about something, the first question that Socrates used to ask people in the Stoics is, do other people feel the same way about this event that you do? Or, other ways that people, do you have a friend who got rejected by a girl and it was like water off a duck's back to him? Or do you have an uncle who asked someone out on a date and they rejected him and he was kind of a little bit upset about it, but then got over it a day later? Are you the only one, who gets really angry about it, right? And if so, then what's the difference between you and them, right? Have you got more fluid building up inside you or something like that? Or is it that you have different beliefs, attitudes, and values that shape your emotional responses, right? That you've interpreted as a catastrophic harm to your self-image or something like that, and they don't, right? So viewing it as a fluid discourages us from questioning the beliefs and attitudes that made us vulnerable to anger in the first place, right? So the Stoics would say, you need to find out why you got angry. Like, what were the beliefs that made you angry, and how do they differ from the beliefs of people that don't get angry about these things? It's not the girl rejecting you that upsets you, but rather your opinions about the girl rejecting you, they would say. That leads in a completely different direction. So rather than blaming other people, it requires us to take more ownership and more responsibility for our emotions. Like, that's the core of Stoicism. You can't do cognitive therapy unless you take more responsibility than normal for your own emotions and begin to look for the beliefs that are causing you to be vulnerable to anger. If you go to the gym and you channel your anger into doing exercise, I mean, of course, that's great. Like, you've done some exercise, fantastic, right? It's done nada, zero, nothing to change the underlying beliefs that made you angry in the first place, though, right? And in fact, it might make you more vulnerable to experiencing anger. It might just further entrench the beliefs that made you vulnerable in the first place. It's a way, it could be viewed as a form of avoidance, like, as a way of avoiding confronting the beliefs and attitudes that made you angry in the first place. So going to the gym's great, right? But and tidying your room and making your bed and all these kind of bits of trite self-improvement advice are fantastic, right? Except insofar as they constitute forms of avoidance, like where people do them instead of questioning the beliefs and attitudes that made them vulnerable to the emotions in the first place. Nowhere in any of the Stoic literature do you find them saying, when you're angry, go to the gym. Like, when you're angry, get it all out of your system. When you're angry, try and suppress those feelings and push them down or mask them with something else. What the Stoics say is that you have to change your perspective and explore the beliefs and alter the assumptions. That's why when Marcus lists all those anger management techniques, there are 10 of them. Like, they all consist in questioning the underlying beliefs or looking at them from different perspectives. They're all cognitive strategies. None of them involve venting, suppression of emotions, channeling emotions into different activities or anything like that, because that wouldn't make any sense to him, because he has a different perspective on what an emotion looks like and how it functions. And he was right. Like, the main thing that the Stoics have right is that they understood the two things, really. One is that emotions are more cognitive. They're more based on beliefs than most people realize. And, that's been validated really by research and psychopathology and cognitive therapy. But also there are voluntary and involuntary. And this has kind of come a little bit later in a sense, but more recently in evidence-based psychotherapy, there's more emphasis on kind of clarifying the distinction between the voluntary and involuntary aspects of our emotional experience. Very simply, I would say my view is that most people that arrive in psychotherapy, certainly for anxiety disorders and to some extent for depression, typically are trying too hard to struggle against the involuntary, or as we say, automatic aspects of anxiety or sadness. And they're failing to take responsibility for the more voluntary, or as we say, strategic aspects of anxiety or depression. I'll give you a for instance. People who suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, which is like pathological worrying, would be a good example of this. So they get really tense and they maybe feel their heart racing. And so what someone in that situation, and there may be like thoughts, worries that pop into their mind, automatic thoughts. You see something on TV and it suddenly makes you think, gee, what if I went bankrupt? Or what if I got a horrible disease? Or, like, so your environment might trigger certain thoughts, or they might just happen spontaneously. You're trying to get to sleep at night and you suddenly have some horrible anxious thought that pops into your mind. So rather than trying to unthink those thoughts or suppress them or conceal them, which is impossible, right? They'll just keep coming back more and more. It's a thankless task, right? Trying to suppress automatic thoughts. Yeah. Right, that you'll tie yourself in knots and really just make the problem worse. Like because of something that we call the paradox of thought suppression, we know that when people try to suppress automatic thoughts, they often just make them more vivid and more frequent, and they also make them more elaborate. So that you create, if a thought pops into your mind but dying of a horrible disease, and you think, oh my God, why am I thinking about this? And you try and kind of block it, you'll end up just thinking about it more and adding more images and turning a thought into a whole kind of like movie, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Not only does the thought become more vivid and more likely to recur, but it now becomes a bigger and more complex and more elaborate thought because you're fueling it and building upon it by trying to struggle against it. So, what we train people to do is accept intrusive thoughts with detached indifference. So they do nothing in response to them, which sounds odd, but that's what most people normally do with automatic thoughts. An ordinary person has hundreds, thousands of automatic thoughts that go through their mind every day. You might be standing on a train platform and suddenly, for no reason at all, you think, I could just shove that old lady under the train, right? And then you might think, gee, that's a weird, why am I thinking that? And then you just shrug it off and you don't think anything else about it. Unless you've got OCD. In which case, if you've got OCD, you think, oh my God, why am I thinking that? Maybe if I keep thinking that, I'm actually going to do it. What's wrong with me? Like, I have to try not to think that. And then someone with OCD is going to become completely obsessed with this intrusive thought, and they'll tie themselves in knots trying to struggle against it. And now they make it into a much bigger problem than it would have been in the first place. Everyone has thoughts like that. Surveys show that people have these intrusive thoughts, but most people just shrug them off and do nothing in response to them. And they're harmless, unless we make them harmful. Now, with generalized anxiety disorder, that's the involuntary aspect. So we need to learn to do less or do nothing in response to those thoughts. But there are voluntary aspects to worrying. We know from research in this area that most people believe that worrying is uncontrollable. If you ask someone with GAD from 0 to 100%, how much control do you have over your worrying? They'll say 0. Like, the whole point they're in therapy is they believe their worrying is uncontrollable. Now, the odd thing about that is that they're basically, in a sense, wrong. Like, worrying is high-level strategic voluntary behavior. The clue is that worrying, as opposed to the initial automatic thought, like the process of thinking about it for hours and dwelling on it and ruminating about it, which sometimes people describe as kind of maladaptive planning or problem-solving behavior. Like, what am I going to do about this? What if this happens? How will I deal with it? Like, that kind of chewing over ruminative thinking about it is a chain of connected thoughts. So it's obvious that chain can be interrupted. Like, it can be redirected, it can be altered. So of course you have voluntary control, in a sense, over the direction that sequence of thoughts takes. You don't control the initial thought, but you control how you then respond to it. But so most people massively underestimate how much voluntary control they have over what we could just call worrying or ruminating that happens afterwards. And so usually people have to be trained to understand various ways in which they can take more control over rumination and alter the voluntary aspects of the thinking process. But again, the Stoics understand this. They realize that there are fantasia, the kind of automatic thoughts and impressions that pop into our mind. And then there are the voluntary judgments and sentences and processes of thinking or reasoning that we exhibit in response to that. And we need to distinguish between things that are up to us and things that are not up to us, both in terms of external events, but also in terms of what's going on within us. This is why the Stoics distinguish between our emotions and the propathei, or the involuntary, automatic aspect of emotion. Seneca calls them the first movements in Latin of emotion. That distinction, that fine-grained distinction, is crucial in modern psychopathology. There are aspects of emotion, the initial automatic thoughts and feelings are not under your direct control, but what you do next, how you respond to that initial experience, is potentially under your control. And so to do any type of therapy, you have to be clear about that distinction, right? Ordinary people, the majority of people in their folk psychology, do not make any distinction between voluntary and involuntary aspects of emotion. And as a result, they're usually very confused about how to respond to emotion. At the very least, you need to get your stance right. You need to get your foundation right. Like, you need to be clear about, it would be like as if you're looking at a watch and you see the hands go round and you just think, that's like magic. I have no idea how this thing works. Like if you're looking at anger. But if you take the back off it and you see, there's various little cogs in it, and I can see how they're interacting with each other and the mechanism. That's how we should understand anger and anxiety. We should be looking at it and going, I can see there's different ingredients here, in different components, and now I understand how they interact with one another. And now I could take this cog out, or I could change this, and it would alter the emotion. I used to say to my clients, your starting point is to understand that anxiety, for instance, is a cake that's baked from many different ingredients. There's flour and sugar and water, and eggs beaten into it, right? It's not just one homogeneous blob. And if you put more water in it or more sugar in it, you end up baking a different type of cake, right? And that's what anger and anxiety, these emotions are like. Once you understand that they're made of multiple ingredients, you change one of the ingredients. Maybe you can change some ingredients, but you can't change the others. You need to figure that out, and then you'll have control over it. But as long as you've got no idea, you're just looking at the front of the watch and seeing the hands magically go round. And again, it's like a primitive, pre-literate, kind of superstitious understanding of how anger and sadness and anxiety actually work. We don't have a hope. And yet, the internet is awash with self-help influencers who have a level of ignorance beyond the most ordinary people, and the advice that they give is polluted by that bad, wobbly initial stance, that flawed set of naive assumptions about the nature of anger or other emotions. And in many cases, the advice they give might even be counterproductive. The advice they give people about coping with their anger, as we kind of alluded to earlier, in some cases might make them even more angry than they were to begin with. I'll give you an example of that. It should strike most people, I think, as pretty obvious that if you look in the comments section on YouTube under some of these self-improvement figures, there are a lot of angry comments. It doesn't seem like their followers are particularly well-adjusted, rational, chill. They seem like foaming at the mouth, and it seems like watching their videos and reading their blogs and their podcasts is making them angrier as opposed to less angry. By consuming that content, their emotional problems are being exacerbated. Like, otherwise, when you read the comments under them, you'd expect to see some indication that people are going, I used to be an angry guy. Like, I used to call people all sorts of idiot on the internet. But now, since I've been watching all these videos by Andrew Tate, or, the many 101 Andrew Tate lights that you find on YouTube, since I've been watching these videos, I'm just so chill. Like, I feel like Marcus Aurelius. Like, nothing really, but you don't see that. You see them at each other's throats and kind of like gradually getting more and more irate as they consume this content, right? So it should be obvious, in a sense, that it's not working and is potentially making people worse. And it's not working because it's based on a crazy set of naive, quasi-superstitious assumptions about the very nature of emotion.
Do you think a lot of the problem can come down to the person receiving the advice? They're self-diagnosing and they're looking for the advice that they want, which often probably isn't the advice they need.
Yeah, that, in a sense, that's a very common, almost universal problem. I mean, you could go right back to Galen's book, makes that point, that Galen says in his book, Plato says this in passing, that love makes us blind. And he said, and everyone loves himself. So we're more blind with regard to ourselves than we are with regard to anyone else. That's his quaint way of putting it, right? I don't know whether I agree with that or not, but it's an interesting, it shows that they're aware of this problem of bias towards our own flaws. And Galen's whole book is preoccupied on his book on the diagnosis and cure of the soul passions is preoccupied really with this idea of how do you find someone who's going to tell you how do you find someone you can trust who's going to tell you when you're being an idiot? Like, because we're all narcissistic in a sense that we're all biased. We don't see our own flaws, like the famous passage in the Bible that says you can see a big plank of wood in someone else's. So you can see the small sliver of wood in someone else's eye. You can see the tiny little flaw in someone else's perspective, but you don't see a whopping great plank of wood in your own eye. So you might have, a huge bias, but you can't see that. Like, but it's easy for you to pinpoint other people's small flaws in other people. So we kind of need other people to some extent to provide an external perspective. How else could we spot our own bias? We're blind to it. Aesop has a fable that's quoted by Galen that says everyone is born with two sacks hanging around their neck, and one is in front of them, and it's a great big sack that contains everyone else's flaws. Like, so we go through our life, like, glaringly obvious right in front of us with a big list of everything that's wrong with everyone else. And angry people in particular are obsessed with this. Like, the politicians, they're like hate figures, cultural Marxists, feminists, foreigners, women, there's like a list of all the things that are wrong with every minority group and every scapegoat and every and they spend a lot of time and energy complaining, like whining about whatever bogeyman or group or whatever it is that they want to currently blame for all of their own problems. Like, it's what we call externalizing emotion, right? It's about blaming other people. I don't need therapy. You guys need therapy. You're the ones that get the problem, right? So those people tend not to address the problem. By their very nature, they're absolutely entrenched in this idea that everyone else is to blame, and so they take zero responsibility, like, for their own mindset and problems. So as I said, we have this big bag of, the cultural Marxists and feminists, like, and MAGA supporters and liberals, like, all their flaws. All the politicians' flaws are in this bag, but everyone else's flaws are, like, really obvious to us. And he says, but we also have a tiny little bag that's behind our back that we can never see, like, but everybody else can see it, and it contains our flaws. Like, but it's always hidden from us. So we've got a blind spot for it. Like, we never see it, but everyone else can see it. They can go, like, you've got this, like, bag of flaws following you around everywhere. Like, yeah, what are you talking about? I can't see it, right? So we need the advice of other people. Now, that's a problem when it comes to self-help by its very nature. I'm a big proponent of self-help, but one huge disadvantage of self-help is if you ask the sickest man in the room for advice, like he's going to be biased. If you ask someone who's depressed or angry or anxious, like, they'll look for a solution from a depressed, angry, or anxious perspective in many cases, and they'll have blind spots and biases that prevent them being able to figure out. This is well known in therapies. For instance, and this kind of relates to what we were talking about a moment ago. Usually at the beginning of psychotherapy, certainly cognitive therapy, we assess clients' existing coping strategies. And typically, clients have a repertoire of coping strategies that are making the problem worse. I'll give you my favorite example. It's really easy. So every single client that I've worked with in therapy, I've assessed. You do a thorough assessment, and one of the questions I always ask is how much caffeine people consume. Right? You need to dig into that a little bit. They're consuming energy drinks. What type of coffee do they drink? And generally for most people, they drink a little bit of coffee or whatever. It's not a big deal. But every single person that I've treated that had insomnia told me that they drank excessive quantities of coffee. Now, why do they drink so much coffee? I had one guy, I said, how many cups of coffee do you drink? He said, well, I drink 3 jugs of coffee. So, you have a filter coffee machine that has a big glass jug or whatever. He would just bring the jug and put it on his desk.
Wow.
A lot of guys that work in IT just on a computer all day and they just have a constant stream of coffee. And he said, I drink about 2 or 3 jugs of coffee a day. He's like, I don't know how many cups are in a jug. And I was like, okay, well, let's not overanalyze. I get the idea. This is a huge amount of coffee, right? And I would say typically, so if I were to drink 3 jugs of coffee a day, I reckon I could give myself insomnia. And that's the way that I usually confront them with the consequences. So why do they do that? So I say, well, what? He said, well, when you put it like that, it seems ridiculous, right? And I say, so why do you drink so much coffee? And he said, I have to, because I'm so tired, because I have insomnia. I said, but you wouldn't have insomnia in the first place if you didn't drink like 3 gallons of coffee a day, right? So it seems comical from an outside perspective, like Galen and Aesop saying, to someone else, you think you've got this bag hanging behind your neck that contains the assumption that coffee helps you cope with insomnia, but everyone else can see it actually is causing your insomnia or making it worse, right? Your flaws are obvious. The mistake you're making is obvious to other people, but it's not obvious to you because you're biased. Now, I would tell that story to the clients that I treated who had anxiety, and they would laugh at it. They'd be like, that guy's an idiot, right? But I'd say, but you're doing the same thing. And they'd be like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I say, but the way that you use to cope with your anxiety is in the longer term, it makes you feel better temporarily. And so you're kind of addicted to it. But in the longer, it's like going to the gym to get rid of your anger. You should feel better, right? But it entrenches the beliefs that made you angry in the first place. It prevents you, distracts you from them. It potentially reinforces the expression of anger, right? So your coping strategies give you temporary relief, but they do nothing to address the underlying problem and might make it worse in some ways, right? That's why you're in therapy. That's why you're sitting here in a consulting room with a therapist right now. Right? That's why you're here. Because you've been using strategies that you're convinced help you, but actually are making your problem worse. So, of course, this is a flaw that we all have. I mean, to put it very simply, it's a little bit more complex than this, but in essence, we are, and even animals, because this really goes back to B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning in a sense, we are prone to developing habits based on what provides us with immediate relief. But often the things that provide us with immediate relief increase our vulnerability, have bad consequences, make the problem worse in the long run. Albert Ellis used to say, there's a difference between feeling better and actually getting better. So lots of people do things that make them feel better, but get worse, right? And I might ask you to do things that make you feel worse temporarily, but actually cause you to get better in the long term. Going to the dentist doesn't make you feel better temporarily. It might hurt. It's pretty uncomfortable, but you have to do it in order to get better in the long term. Going to the gym, if you're really unfit and unhealthy, like the first few weeks of going and doing exercise, like maybe feel quite uncomfortable, like exhausting, right? But you have to do it if you want to get better in the long term. Sometimes we have to endure tolerate discomfort, like in order to get better longer term. But we are constantly duped by going for the easy option and things that make us feel better temporarily, but cause us to get worse in the long term. We have this kind of short-sightedness that biases us. And it's hard. Like, people are very poor judges in many cases of what's in the long-term interest. So for sure, if therapy is mainly takes the form of self-help, the risk is you're just going to get people opting for these short-term maladaptive coping strategies that therapists we call them safety-seeking behaviors in anxiety treatment. Like, so, techniques that make people feel safe in the short term, but increase their vulnerability. That, put very simply, the number one most popular there are many coping strategies that people have. I mean, there are many research studies that list different ways that people have of coping with anxiety, for instance. There's a bunch of different things you could do when you feel anxious. But the world's number one most popular coping strategy, even in squirrels and in fish, like, and probably in insects, the most ingrained, fundamental, primitive, and world's most popular coping strategy is avoidance. Like, so if you're suppose for a moment that you're a squirrel, right, and you're in the woods and you're going to your favorite spot for getting nuts, and a tree falls down and it scares the living bejesus out of you because you're only a squirrel. So you jump 3 feet in the air and run in the opposite direction as far as your little feet can carry you, right? As you'd expect, right? So you're startled by a loud noise and you run in the opposite direction. Avoidance brings immediate relief from anxiety. But if you continually run away in the opposite direction from the best place in the woods to get nuts, you're going to starve to death, right? So what would normally happen is the squirrel goes back the next day if it really wants the nuts, and the tree doesn't fall down. So the perceived danger wasn't real, right? It was just a loud noise, right? It's nothing bad happened. So you go back, it's still going to be anxious, right? It's going to find it hard to approach the spot, right? Maybe it'll get close and then run away again. And then it goes back the next day, its anxiety will be diminished. This is what we call emotional habituation, technically, right? It has to happen for animals to adapt to their environment. So if there's no genuine danger there, your anxiety has to wear off through repeated exposure to the situation. If there isn't any danger, like with anxiety disorders, there's no real danger, right? So we have to get people to face the things that make them feel anxious repeatedly and for prolonged periods until their anxiety would naturally wear off. In the same way that the anxiety of a dog or a horse or a squirrel would wear off through prolonged exposure. But people typically feel a strong urge to avoid situations that provoke anxiety. And so the danger is that in our society, we have so many subtle forms of avoidance, right? So it used to be that if something frightened you, your only option was to run away from it. But now you could go and take drugs instead. You could go and drink beer. You could sit and watch Netflix all evening and not think about it anymore. Like, you can lie in bed all day. Like, there are 101 other ways that you could potentially avoid confronting the things that make you feel anxious. And ironically, doing self-help is one of them. Like, so if you go on and you do self-help and it's doing everything under the sun except getting you to actually confront your fears, you can turn. People who are anxious will find ways unintentionally to turn everything into a form of avoidance. And they'll very often they'll turn self-help. They may even turn therapy sometimes. As therapists, we have to be on our guard against that. The client can sometimes turn therapy into Freud even had names for that. He called this the flight into cure. Like, we have to be cautious that the client isn't turning the therapy into a form of avoidance. Like, we have to be cautious that we keep them on track. They're like a wriggling fish almost. Like, people are twist and turn, desperately trying to avoid confronting their fears, but it's the one thing, that we most robustly know will typically cure them. Even the Stoics appear to have realized this. Aesop, again, has a fable about the lion and the fox that describes emotional habituation pretty clearly, and almost in exactly the way that I just described it to you. And, like, the internet is awash with self-help, but it maybe people are looking at the wrong type of self-help. I mean, earlier I said, these kind of pieces of advice, like tidy your room and make your bed and things. Yeah, go to the gym. Like, that's all good advice. People get up in arms if you object to it, but it becomes bad advice if it turns into a form of avoidance. It's not intrinsically good advice. It might help some people, it might not help other people. Tidying your room is going to do nada to help you change your underlying beliefs about women turning you down for a date, I would think. I don't really see the connection. I mean, I'm sure there's one guy out there that went, I tidied my room, and as I was doing it, I suddenly had an epiphany. Right? But I don't think so. Like, I think 99.9% of people, it would just be another form of avoidance,
Just a quick word for today's sponsor, Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. I just want to quickly talk about Huel Daily Greens, because I'm loving Huel Daily Greens. I'm having them every morning. And what do I love about them? First of all, they're healthy. I do like eating healthy foods. Just maybe placebo effect makes me feel really good about myself, that I'm going in the right direction. But I also know my body's getting what it needs, which is good. And it's so easy to set up. You just put a scoop in, shake it up. I can do it with one hand, which is often the case when I'm carrying things or I'm carrying my daughter. I can do all these and just multitask. And then I've got a delicious daily green on the go. And I know it's healthy. And it's the same with the meals. Easy to make, tasty, delicious, nutritious. And if you have any interest in Huel products, click the link in the description. Let's enjoy the rest of the talk. So I kind of feel like I'm guilty of, or I was guilty of a lot of what you've been saying, especially with my own anxiety. I've used self-help, been really productive, exercise, just as a way to mask it, because I thought that was helping, but it kind of never helped. What should I do instead?
There are many things that you can do to deal with anxiety. And in all honesty, from a psychotherapy perspective, the first thing we usually have to do is distinguish between different types of anxiety. Because there's PTSD, there's OCD, there's GAD, there's phobic anxiety, there's social anxiety. Right. So all these different forms of anxiety have certain things in common, but they're also slightly different from one another. So the treatments for them are slightly different because the cause and the cure is different. However, phobic generally, the old kind of simplistic way of looking at it, is the base form of anxiety is what we call specific phobia. Phobic anxiety is kind of the basic template for understanding other types of anxiety, like fear of snakes, fear of heights, stuff like that. It's just exposure, like I described below. The single most robustly supported intervention in the entire field of psychotherapy research is exposure therapy. And that involves facing your fears systematically, repeatedly, and for prolonged periods. Let me kind of explain how that would adapt to different problems. So bearing in mind, other types of anxiety sometimes have their own quirks. They have more cognitive elements. But for instance, if you have a fear of spiders, you see a spider, it triggers anxiety. In a condition like PTSD, there are elements of that, but it's more like a memory triggers the anxiety. So then instead of exposing yourself, you might expose yourself to situations that trigger anxiety and PTSD, but a big part of PTSD involves remembering things repeatedly and for prolonged periods. So rather than holding a spider in your hand, it'd be more about closing your eyes and reliving a scene. But it's still exposure therapy. It's what we call imaginal exposure therapy. For social anxiety, people with social anxiety disorder don't typically fear other people's faces. Like seeing a spider makes a spider-phobic anxious. There might be an element of that, but it's really fear of negative evaluation that underlies social anxiety. So it's a fear of what other people might be thinking, like of you. So social anxiety is more cognitive. It's more about something hypothetical, like rather than something tangible. So we have to treat that in a slightly different way. And there are other complicating factors. So in social anxiety, the way that you focus your attention is integral. Like people with social anxiety tend to focus all of their attention on themselves in a number of different ways. So they might be preoccupied with their breathing. They might be thinking about whether their hands are shaking. They might be imagining what their face looks like. They might be observing their own thoughts and rehearsing what they're going to say before they say it out loud. And all of those things contribute to social anxiety and make it worse. Basically, that in itself is kind of like a coping strategy. Like I'm trying to breathe differently to control my anxiety. Yeah, but by doing that, you're making yourself much more self-conscious than normal. So your attempt to control your breathing is probably making your social anxiety much worse, right? And long story short, has other negative effects. So with social anxiety, we train people to focus their attention externally more, but also we would expose them to negative evaluation or the perception of it. How do we do that? We get people who are socially anxious to, the easiest way is to get people who are socially anxious to deliberately make mistakes, right? So I would, what was I saying? Damn, hang on a minute. I lost my place there. I'm only pretending, right? But if I had social anxiety, I'd pretend that I've forgotten what I was saying. Yeah, because people with social anxiety say, "I'm terrified that I might suddenly my mind might go blank," and a therapist might say, "Well, so what? Like, is it really that big a deal? Right? You know, would it be the end of the world if your mind went blank? You know, how could you recover from that? How do you think other people might recover from it if their mind goes blank? You know." You could just say to the audience, like, I lost my place. But just remind me what I was saying there. Like, people do that. It's not that big a deal, right? So with social anxiety, you would need to expose yourself to potential negative evaluation by deliberately making mistakes, like knocking over a glass of water. I used to knock over the flip chart, like make a real racket, like spill a glass of water, like pronounce a word wrong, like, you know, forget what I was saying, go up to strangers in the street and just ask them a ridiculous question. Like, you know, it's easy with social anxiety because the client will say, there is no way that you're going to get me to do that. Like, and as a therapist, you go, bingo. That's exactly what we should do then. Albert Ellis used to get the clients with social anxiety to go to the shop with him, and they get a banana, they tie a bit of string around it, and they'd go to a shopping mall and they'd walk around the shopping mall with a banana on a piece of string like they were walking a dog. And that's the sort of thing, people with social anxiety disorder would be like, there is not a chance in hell that you're going to get me ever to do that. But the therapist knows that then if I can get you to do that, you're going to experience social anxiety, and you need to experience social anxiety in order to come out the other side of it. So if you do it repeatedly, after a while, you won't care. Because like the squirrel in the forest, you're going to think, I went back to where that tree fell down and nothing ever happened. Like, I've been there 100 times now, and it's like, you know, no one's died. Like, you know, the anxiety was just a kind of false alarm, right? So you realize you have to accept your anxiety to get used to it and realize my anxiety is empty. It's vacuous. It's a false alarm. So you really feel like there's nothing to it, and then it'll wear off. So those are some of the ways in which different forms that exposure might take. Now, what most people do is they don't expose themselves for long enough, right? So the way I'd explain this to clients, I used to have a graph that I would just pull out my drawer and show to clients in my consulting room. And it was the heart rate of a genuine case study, a woman who had a cat phobia. So heart rate is a pretty good indication of anxiety. And I would say to my clients, if you take someone who has a cat phobia and you put them in a room with a couple of cats in it, a small room, like what would happen to their heart? Like if we were monitoring the heart rate, and they would say, I expect their heart rate would go up. And I would say, okay, right, so far so good. See, easy question. Let's now we'll get into some harder questions. How much would the heart rate go up by? And they say, well, I'm not really sure. And I say it would almost double in most cases. How quickly would it go up? And they'd say right away. I say, yeah, like really just within a couple of seconds. Like as if you were running flat out, like your heart rate like might almost double. And then I would say, and what would happen next? And that's usually most people with anxiety disorders, when you ask them what would probably happen next, will look at you blankly for a couple of minutes, because they'll be like, and I think it's partly that they don't want to say the obvious, and partly that they're kind of confused or conflicted, right? But the answer that they'll give eventually is, I guess the heart rate will have to go back down, maybe. And they're always really uncertain about that. But I guess, maybe, I don't know. I don't feel like mine would, but like I guess it has to. Your heart rate can't remain at that level forever. Like, I go, yeah, like your heart rate will go back down to approximately its resting level or close thereto. And I'll maybe show them this graph and go, this is this lady's heart rate. It shoots up as soon as she goes in a room full of cats. And I say, how long would it take? It's another hard question before your heart rate would go down. And they say, I have no idea. And I say, I don't know for sure either. It varies quite a lot. But a ballpark might take 5 minutes, might take 45 minutes, depends on the nature of the anxiety, the individual client, broadly speaking. But eventually your anxiety abates naturally. It wears off. Why don't people know that? Because when you have anxiety, hand in hand with it goes an urge to avoid the situation. So most people would bail and leave the room when their anxiety peaks. So they would never discover that if they stay in the room and ride their anxiety out, the heart rate's going to gradually go down. Their anxiety is going to gradually diminish. They would deny themselves that knowledge or experience because anxiety causes them to feel a powerful, overwhelming urge to flee the room. Another good question is, so why on earth would anyone choose to stay in a room where they have an overwhelming urge to turn around and flee at the door? What would normally cause someone to do that? Is an interesting question, right? So people will normally say, like, exceptional self-discipline, right? Well, exceptional self-discipline is rare, right? And most people don't have the self-discipline, like, unless something unusual happens to really compel them. Like, most people lack the self-discipline to put themselves in a room full of spiders if they have a spider phobia and sit there for half an hour, right? It doesn't happen very often for a reason. But there's another variable that would lead someone to do that, and it's the presence of another person encouraging them to remain in the room. Now, normally, that would be your mum or your dad when you're a child and you're scared of dogs or scared of going and swimming in the ocean or something like that. And your mum or your dad would say, it's fine. And they'd encourage you to keep petting the dog or keep swimming in the water until you get used to it, right? So it's a social psychological variable. It's the presence of another person. And in therapy, maybe in some sports, or even in some professions, it's a coach or a therapist's presence, like the really, unfortunately, I wish that people would have the discipline to do it on their own, but usually it requires somebody else to come along and stand beside them and encourage them. So then, that's why the therapist has a role in exposure therapy. And so we see the anxiety, the natural habituation curve, like the anxiety goes down. Okay, next question. What happens if this lady with the cat phobia comes back tomorrow and we put her in the room with the cats? And the client rightly will usually say, I guess their anxiety, the heart rate will go up again, right? Because, even exposure therapy is not going to make their anxiety go away. And I say, yeah, but it will typically not go as high as it did the first time. and it will usually abate more quickly. Like, so yesterday it took like 20 or 30 minutes. Today it might only take 10 or 15 minutes for it to go back down to its resting level. What happens if on day 3 she comes back and we put her in a room with cats? Well, anxiety will go up, but less than it was on day 2, and it will abate maybe within 5 minutes or something like that. And if we keep doing that for like 4 or 5 days, like eventually the anxiety would extinguish completely. Right. And the thing about anxiety, it's a little bit different with generalized anxiety or social anxiety, but the basic form of anxiety, like phobic anxiety, once it doesn't tend to recur, it doesn't usually relapse unless something causes it to. Like the squirrel going in the forest, once the squirrel goes back and nothing bad happens and its anxiety abates naturally, it doesn't normally spontaneously get anxious again. Like, unlike other problems, phobic anxiety, once it's extinguished, is usually gone forever, pretty much. Now the truth is, with something like social anxiety, it's more complicated because you're thinking, and worrying and anticipation are factors, and society is more of a factor, but the basic, all of that's kind of superstructure. What's underlying it is the same kind of basic, like, phobic anxiety. So we have to, the success rate in treating phobic anxiety is about 90% in exposure therapy, but social anxiety, it's only 75%. That's still good, but it's a little bit lower because social anxiety is more complicated, right? And generalized anxiety, PTSD, also a little bit more abstract, a little bit more cognitive. But you can see all of these essentially in some shape or form consist in facing our fears. Now, what would happen to that woman if she was in a room full of cats and her anxiety went through the roof and the therapist wasn't there, or the therapist allowed the woman to bail within the first minute? Like, and then on day 2, we brought her back in the room. Well, her anxiety wouldn't be any lower, might even be higher, because escape behavior, as it's sometimes called. Escape is when you feel anxiety and then you bail from it. Technically, avoidance is when you prevent yourself from going in the room to begin with. Escape would be you go in the room and then leave quickly. Right. So escaping from a high level of anxiety in some cases increases sensitization. So this is another reason that people sometimes struggle, because sometimes people go, I do face my fear, I try to speak at work. Social anxiety is tricky because you need to, the key variable has long been known to be duration, right? And so if you terminate exposure or bail too quickly, you might make your anxiety worse in some cases. Now, that's another reason it's a little bit harder to treat something like social anxiety, because with spider phobia or cat phobia, you go in a room and there's a cat there, a spider there, you could sit there all afternoon if you wanted to until you get bored and your anxiety wears off. But with social anxiety, how long can you expose yourself to the fear of negative evaluation? It's more abstract and social and fleeting, so it's a little bit harder to maintain the duration for longer. So people will be in a meeting at work and then they'll have to speak and then they'll feel really anxious and they maybe keep doing that and they keep feeling anxious, but the duration of the exposure might only be 30 seconds each time, right? And so that might increase sensitization rather than, allowing them to habituate because it's not long enough. So sometimes you have to engineer clever situations where they have enough time to get used to speaking in front of other people and for their anxiety to wear off. The same would go for things like PTSD. One problem would be if you visualize a memory, it might be hard. It's hard for someone to remain visualizing a memory for more than a few minutes at a time. Like, so the way that we would do that is to make it a lot more repetitive. Like, so you picture it and then break maybe for a second, and then picture it again and picture it again and picture it again, or use videos of related scenes, or get them to write a description and read it aloud, for instance. So sometimes you've got to come up, the hard part of exposure therapy sometimes is coming up with ways to maintain the exposure for long enough for the anxiety to wear off. That's why social anxiety can be a little bit of a trickier problem, because it's hard to maintain it long enough. like for the anxiety to wear off. In a sense, I said get bored. Like the feeling that you have when you expose yourself really to an anxiety trigger is a bit like boredom. Like, so it's like, I'm like, I feel like I've been looking at this photograph of a spider for an hour now. You know, it's kind of tedious. But the moment that you feel bored or tedious looking at a spider, you're not anxious looking at a spider anymore. Like, and that's another reason people find it hard. I think when people are left to their own devices to do self-help, they'll take techniques like that but then get bored and stop doing them. And then the risk is that they're not doing them. It would be like if you were trying to exercise at home and, you know, you do sit-ups or something like that, but then you get kind of bored doing it after a while. And it's easier if you're training with a partner or you've got a coach and they can kind of keep encouraging you to persevere beyond that point of fatigue or boredom. Like, you know, when you feel tired, when you feel bored, that's an indication that you're almost there. You just need to push yourself a little bit further. Like, but most people, again, lack the discipline to do that by themselves, unfortunately. So what you end up with that's another reason why with online self-help influencers, you often, what you get is self-help being used as in a kind of more subtly avoidant way. Like, so people are doing everything except facing their fears consistently enough to actually get some kind of benefit from them. By the way, I'll just mention one other thing about that as an aside. I mentioned earlier in passing that social anxiety is well known now to be exacerbated by self-focused attention. Now, I didn't mention or didn't emphasize at the time, but many self-help techniques inherently increase self-focused attention. So repeating a mantra to yourself, breathing differently, changing your posture. Jordan Peterson tells people that they should stand up straight for some weird reason that has to do with lobsters, right? That I fail to understand, but like it seems complete pseudoscientific hogwash to me. But something to do, for some reason that he believes to do with lobsters holding their claws up, he thinks that people should keep their posture straight and look people in the eye. In my experience, that's terrible advice for people with social anxiety because it's typically just going to increase self-focused attention and fuel social anxiety. That's exactly the sort of thing that clients coming into therapy with social anxiety tell you that they're already doing as a coping strategy. And usually the therapist will say, how about you stop doing that? Like, and abandon your existing self-help techniques and coping strategies, because it might be that they're actually causing the problem to worsen in ways that you hadn't anticipated. So with social anxiety, it's often the case that people have these techniques that make them overly self-focused, like in a way. And another consequence of that is, I kind of hinted at a moment ago, is that when people are using any type of self-help technique, almost any type, it tends to increase cognitive load. So it requires thinking. So if I'm giving a wedding speech and I visualize, like, sort of advice that people used to say is, imagine everybody's naked apart from their socks, right? Great, right? Well, try doing that while giving a speech, right? It's like walking and chewing gum, I call it, right? It's like rubbing your tummy and patting your head at the same time. So I'm going to visualize everyone naked and I'm going to remember the speech and make it funny at the same time. Like, it's too many things to juggle for most people, especially if you're anxious, right? When you're anxious or under stress, your brain's capacity to handle cognitive load is significantly decreased, right? So you can't walk and chew gum when you're anxious. Right? It's one or the other, right? You can't rub your tummy and pat your head. You've got to pick one. You cannot visualize the audience naked and give a funny speech to them at the same time. For some people, I'm sure can, but for most people, they just get confused, like, because their brain is trying to do too many things at once. And that's the case with a lot of self-help strategies, particularly for social anxiety, that often they are making people feel more awkward and they make more mistakes because they're doing things that actually increase their cognitive load. So really what you want people to do is do less and shift more of the focus onto the audience, because that's more natural. Like, when you're talking to people normally, you forget about everything else, like, and you're just engrossed in the conversation. and you're focusing all of your attention on the audience or on the other person. And so obviously you're not repeating a mantra or visualizing things like that. That's going to feel super awkward. The way we normally in therapy, we try to prove this to clients. And the way we do that is you'd sit with someone and you say, tell me what you did yesterday. I'm just going to sit and listen. I'll time you 30 seconds. Tell me a story about what you did yesterday, who you met, what you ate. Run me through the story, and they'll do it. So far, so good, right? It's pretty easy, even for someone with social anxiety. Now, okay, so I want you to do that now, but concentrate on your breathing and repeat a mantra to yourself. Tell me what you did day before yesterday. 30 seconds, go. And usually they'll say, well, I felt really awkward. So I was trying to do too many things at once. And then the therapist will say, but isn't that what you're doing every time you're in a meeting? And they'll go, well, I guess it is. And the therapist will say, so the things that you're doing make you feel more awkward and self-conscious. Why don't you stop doing them then? It's easy to prove that if you add in these other coping behaviors, they increase your cognitive load and make you feel self-conscious and awkward. But if you go on the internet, that's what you get told to do by influencers.
Yeah. It's funny when you're explaining social anxiety, and it's literally like you're explaining my journey to improvement. I watch these videos where it's like slow down your breathing, focus on your posture, and all I'm doing when I got into a situation is I'm going, oh, my breath's too fast. I can't slow it down. Then I'm like, what am I doing? You don't know what to do, and you're trying to focus on. You're not focusing on the moment. You're focusing on trying to do all these coping mechanisms. But the way I found improvement, well, first of all, I did exposure, and then because it was a bad experience, it wasn't a pleasant experience. Maybe I did some speaking with people for an hour, and it didn't go horrible, but it wasn't the best experience. But then because it was a negative experience, I put it off for a year. And then I'm kind of in my mind remembering that moment and catastrophizing it, making it really bad. I'm never doing that again. And my way I got past it was just every single day I was doing Zoom, just over Zoom, kind of what we're doing now.
Yeah, I was going to ask if podcasting and things makes a difference, because that is prolonged. Podcasting, in a sense, is potentially prolonged exposure.
Yeah, so I found that the consistency, I do one, and maybe I've got that anxious feeling for a while, and then I lose it, and then the next one it's shorter, and then I get comfortable quicker, and then the consistency of doing maybe 20 in a row, but by the 10th one, all those feelings are kind of gone, and I've just got the feeling of excitement.
When I was a young guy, I think in a sense, by the way, social anxiety to some extent is normal, and the majority of people experience it. It's not some, like most things, when it gets really severe and someone sees a therapist, it's just a more extreme version of something that almost everyone experiences to some extent. And particularly at different stages in life, even animal phobias are normal. Certain types, there's a genetic predisposition to experience snake phobias and dog phobias and things. Usually 2-year-olds are frightened of dogs, not all of them. But it's pretty normal, because a dog's like a horse to a 2-year-old kid. Yeah. Could send it flying, right? So normally there's a developmental stage where we go through, and then often in our teens we become socially anxious, and then gradually we get over it. When I was a young guy, I went through the same thing. I naturally, just by chance, I've stumbled on the idea that if I just throw myself into this and keep doing it, the anxiety will wear off. And then sometimes it can take a while, with social anxiety in particular, if you're doing it yourself. But I think also there really is just a point you reach eventually where there's a little voice at the back of your brain that's just kind of I've done this 1,000,000 times now, right? And no one has died, right? So far, there's just, it becomes so obvious. You drum it into yourself so many times, it becomes so obvious. There's a part of you that just thinks, I've literally done this hundreds of times now. So it seems ridiculous to get anxious about something that I've done so many times before. Your brain just gives in.
Yeah.
It's like your brain's like, all right, give in, nothing bad's going to happen. Like, you've done it, you've proven your point. We've done it 100 times and nobody's died. Like, okay, what's the point? There's no right. We're kind of wasting our time being anxious about this now. Like, it's like there's like a little animal part of your brain that eventually you could, like, gives up and he's like, I surrender, you're right, it's safe. Like, nothing bad happens. But yeah, with social anxiety, there are other techniques that we can use to deal with it. But the core of everything is usually some kind of something like, say, podcasting or giving talks, or like, until I think Toastmasters for some people is a good. It used to be hard to come up with ways for people to get public speaking experience. I used to refer a lot of my clients to go to Toastmasters. But with the internet now and Zoom and stuff, it's a bit easier to, podcasting is a great way, for some people, to do repeated prolonged exposure to social interaction of a sort. Like, it's not the right solution for everybody. But I think the Stoics are also aware of this. They talk about, how we're easily affected by the opinions of other people. One other thing I'd say about it, I'll tell you another. We've said a lot about exposure. The Stoics are aware of a less well-known technique called cognitive distancing. And cognitive distancing can be important in social anxiety because spider phobia, PTSD, things like that resemble classical conditioning more. Like the tree falls in the forest, it scares the bejesus out of you. It's a conditioned response, like Pavlov and his dogs, right? It's just association. But social anxiety is more cerebral. It's a little bit more interpretative. It's a little bit more cognitive. It's a little bit socio-cognitive. And like I said, the exposure is trickier. Now, social anxiety is sometimes described as the fear of negative evaluation. So if you could pinpoint that and expose yourself directly to the negative evaluation that you fear, it can work. Now, how do you do that? Like, you can create situations. But another way of doing it is to identify a sentence that sums up. I mean, for some people, it's just like, everyone's going to think I'm an idiot. So it may be like, Donald is an idiot, right? And what certain forms of social anxiety treatment, like more recently, do is get the client to imagine that they can see the words. Like, so I might imagine that I'm talking to you. I could do it literally. I could write Donald as an idiot on a piece of paper and put it on my computer while I'm talking to you, so it's there all the time in front of me. So I'm now exposing myself to the actual sentence, the idea that I fear. What would be ideal would be if you could get a t-shirt printed that says Donald is an idiot. So at first, right, I'd be like, oh, that's my big fear, is that people think I'm an idiot. But if I'm talking to you for like an hour and the whole time you've just got a t-shirt on that says, after a while, I'm just going to tune out from it. I'm going to get used to it. So it doesn't really bother me anymore. I'm going to desensitize to it, if you like, or, my anxiety will extinguish. So that's one way that more recently therapists have kind of experimented with getting people to expose themselves to a concept. Now with social anxiety, it's tricky because you want to decrease cognitive load and shift your focus outwards. So you don't really want to be visualizing stuff at the same time. But, you can, for example, visualize that you're looking at people or looking at a situation through a window and the sentence is written on the window on a marker pen. So you have it in your awareness continually. So you can get bored with it, basically, and desensitized to it. Or I'll tell you another social anxiety technique that I don't claim to have invented anything in therapy, but all cognitive therapists have to invent their own exposure techniques. And I came up with one that I'm sure other people have figured this out, but I'm very proud of this, right? So as part of my methodology of asking my social anxiety disorder clients, things that they tell me there's not a cat in hell's chance that they would ever do. Like, so one of them would be, with most of those clients, admitting that they have social anxiety would make them socially anxious because it they want to conceal that, right? So I thought, how can we force you to admit that you have social anxiety in front of a group of strangers? And then one day it hit me like a diamond bullet straight between the eyes. I had an epiphany. I said to my client, what if I asked you to walk in to a bar this afternoon? Well, I used to go out with clients in the field and do exposure. So we'll go out on Oxford Street usually, right? There's not many bars on Oxford Street actually, but around about there, or a cafe sometimes, a coffee shop. And I said, we'll go in a Starbucks, and I want you to speak up to everybody in the room and say, excuse me, everybody, excuse me. Like, I came in here earlier and I think I might have dropped a book. And I was wondering if anybody's found it. It's called Overcoming Social Anxiety and Blushing. Has anybody seen a copy of Overcoming Social Anxiety and Blushing that I might have left behind at my table earlier when I was in here? Like, and my clients would say, there's not a cat and health chance that I'm doing that, right? So I said, good, because like it triggers social anxiety, right? And usually I'd do it first. So I'll do it, right? You just come with me, I'll do it. So I go in places and I say, hey, has anyone found a copy of Social Anxiety? After a while, you run out of places to do it. That's the only thing. You came in here last week and says you must have said book, right? So I had to keep trying different places. So I go, and then after a while, I say to the client would be like anxious watching me do it, but I do it like in 3 or 4 different places. And then I did it. My favorite one was I did it in a sex shop in Soho, like, that sold sex toys and stuff. And they were so nice. They were easily the nicest shop staff out of anywhere that I had to do this. And then the client, after 3, 4, 2, 3, I'll say, why don't you do it now? You've watched me do it enough times. You're getting bored watching me do it. So, why don't you do it? So I get the client then to walk in. And that's a more on the nose way of getting them to confront. So podcasting, is one way of putting yourself in a social situation, but you can more directly confront fear of negative evaluation by, either saying or doing something stupid on purpose. Like cognitive therapists get their clients to go up to strangers in the street and ask them what year it is and things like that, which works for some people. It's a bit wacky. Or just going in a cafe or whatever and saying, hey, has anyone in here seen a copy of, how to cure hemorrhoids, or like how, overcoming social anxiety and blushing or something or some other embarrassing.
Yeah. Is that why Zeno was forced to go around with a pot of soup?
I think so. He were told he was shy. He maybe had social anxiety. And then I think part of that story might be that he becomes friends with King Antigonus. So Epictetus says he was able to talk to this guy as if he was his equal. So he goes from being very shy and socially anxious to seemingly doing this. There's one way of interpreting the fragments. They're a little bit ambiguous. You could read it you could read the whole story in a bit of a different way. But if he successfully overcomes his anxiety, he gets lentil soup poured all over him. And he has to walk around the Ceramicus, which is the prostitutes district, by the way, as well as being where they sold pottery, and it was a cemetery. So he's walking past all these hookers with lentil soup dribbling down his legs, feeling super embarrassed. And then eventually he's self-confident enough that he's able to talk to this guy that's like a king or almost an emperor, like most powerful man in the region, as if he's his equal. He's not intimidated by him at all.
Have you ever used any of these? I know you've done them whilst helping clients, but have you ever actually in the past used them to help yourself?
Yeah, a lot. Because I don't know, I very early on, it seemed to me ridiculous to try to teach clients therapy techniques that I hadn't in some way used myself. So then the difficulty is that if the client has a problem that you don't really have yourself, then you have to come up with something that's similar enough, like that you can go, I've done something a bit like this. But the one that always sticks in my mind actually is I haven't done a lot of work with pain management, but I've done a bit of work with pain management. And one of my mentors when I was a young guy training in therapist initially is a guy who's like a world authority on pain management. He's like an amazing guy based in London. He's a clinical hypnotist called John Butler. He did a live hernias operation. He hypnotized somebody to have a hernia operation live on Channel 4 years and years ago, like a decade or more ago. It's a great, you can probably still find it on YouTube or it was pretty amazing. So for pain management, it's ridiculous to teach someone pain management techniques if you haven't used them yourself. I mean, and clients, for certain problems, clients are more likely to go, have you done that? Like, they're not going to take you seriously and they'll question it. If you haven't, you go, oh, I've never done it. I don't know. Like, but I think you could learn it. Like, that seems absurd, right? So the therapist has to model, as we put it, the behavior. Like, and the way that we do that is, this seems kind of masochistic, but trust me, it's not. I'd rather not be inflicting pain on myself. But in experiments, what they sometimes do is pack your arm in ice. I've done that. That hurts a lot. It's pretty scary. Or usually the easier thing to do is attach Alice clamps, like kind of forceps, to the skin on the back of your hand, which pinches a lot, right? And most people find it too painful. Some people have different pain thresholds, but like in my experience, very few people will tolerate that. But you can use pain management techniques to cope with it. Usually you can demonstrate that in a consulting room with a client. I think it's probably videos of me doing it somewhere. And then, you can show the client and then the client can do the same thing, and that way you can practice actually using the technique together so that they learn how to do self-hypnosis or use some kind of cognitive therapy technique to manage pain. And generally speaking, it's hard to do in CBT. CBT in some sense is based on learning theory. And it's generally Freud didn't think this way, and Carl Jung didn't think this way, and like other old school psychotherapists didn't think this way. But in CBT, it's kind of an assumption that it's hard to bring about change unless you, not just for the purposes of exposure therapy, but for other reasons. If you don't actually get the client to put themselves in the problem situation, how are you really going to know for sure that they've improved? Right. And clients, when they come into therapy, because they're paying a lot of money normally, will usually say, how am I going to know that this is working? And you'll say, well, have you had therapy before? And they'll go, I had psychoanalysis or something, or I had counseling. And you say, how did you know whether it was working or not? And they'll say, I didn't. Like, I was just turning up to sessions. I don't know if it's working or not. And I say, well, cognitive behavioral therapy is fundamentally different, right? We're going to plan experiments. So we go out on a regular basis. And we test you in a range of situations and we measure your improvement. If I have to, I'll go out with you, right? Or you can do it between sessions, or there's some things maybe we can do in the consulting room, potentially, but we have to test you in order to measure your progress. So I have to be able to do things. And I think unintentionally, I guess, for instance, if I'm doing in the field exposure and I'm modeling it, then I have to learn how to manage anxiety in some awkward situations. Maybe take a little bit of getting used to. But I've tried to use similar techniques. One of the reasons I became interested in Stoicism was because it struck me that if I was going to use as many CBT techniques as I could for my own improvement so that I could look my client in the eye and say, I've done similar things myself, I would have to have some kind of self-improvement framework, which doesn't really exist in CBT. And I thought, if we take CBT's concepts and techniques and turn them into an ongoing self-improvement regime, what would that look like? And I thought, I think it would kind of look a bit like Stoicism, to be honest. If you take it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them, and turn that into a philosophy of life. It's kind of like Stoicism, pretty much, to a large extent. And that was one of the reasons I became interested in Stoicism. But it would take me a long time to give lots of different examples, but I'm pretty sure I haven't done every cognitive therapy technique, but some of them I've used, even ones that I don't use with my clients very much. There are techniques that I've just used generally for self-improvement. Like, for instance, with clients with depression, we usually do a thing called activity scheduling, and we might get them to keep track of what they're doing in each hour of the day. So it's a bit like, when you keep a calendar or a diary, you write down maybe what you did each day. But the difference in activity scheduling is you break it down much further into what did you do during each hour of the day. And then you try and introduce as many rewarding activities or activities that are meaningful and in accord with your core values each day. So I've tried to do that myself for self-improvement and also for better time management in terms of, work and stuff. I've used those techniques sometimes to overcome anxiety or just for general self-improvement that I've derived from CBT.
Earlier, you were saying about you was learning Kung Fu or Karate, and you're saying how you're looking to how to learn, a spinning kick, but you always kind of got the simple advice of just focusing on your stance. And then you gave an example of Marcus Aurelius giving advice, but you also gave just a stance. Do you have any Marcus Aurelius spinning kicks?
Yeah, I guess it's a matter of perspective. What's more kind of complex or what's more basic? Let me think. There are many, many different techniques and concepts. I suppose one might be the view from above. Can be used as quite an elaborate visualization technique. We started teaching Stoicism because I was using a lot of these Stoic techniques on workshops with therapists and in conferences and stuff. When I first started teaching Stoicism, I mainly was speaking about it at therapy conferences because it wasn't it didn't exist really as a popular form of self-help back then. Like, weirdly, I have to remind myself of that sometimes. I was like, oh yeah, it was completely different like 25 years ago. Like, I was only talking at therapy conferences about this stuff. And, we could see many parallels, myself and my students and stuff. But the view from above intrigued everybody because it looked credible, plausible. It looked like the sort of thing that would make sense in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy, but that it wasn't something that we typically do in cognitive behavioral therapy. And some techniques, I'm interested in research. All cognitive behavioral therapists are interested in research because it's research-driven, evidence-based practice, right? Unlike psychoanalysis to some extent. People might do other types of psychotherapy. They never really, in some cases, they might not read any research studies. But in CBT, you have to read research because it's evidence-based. And so then you become interested in, well, some forms of therapy are untestable, pretty much. Freudian psychoanalysis is virtually impossible to do proper clinical trials on because it takes so long. Freud saw his clients for 5 years on average, and he saw them 5 times a week. Now, there's no way you could do a randomized control trial on that just because it would be exorbitantly expensive and take, I don't know, it'd take you 5 years to do. It'd be crazy. Just because the nature of the therapy just really doesn't lend itself to it. Whereas some forms of CBT might be done in 3 hours. So it's much easier to do a randomized control trial. It's a lot more practical. But some techniques, like cognitive therapy, as it's traditionally done, which involves identifying thoughts, asking lots of different questions, is hard to operationalize. So, because if you have 10 different therapists, they're probably doing slightly different things, right? It's a little bit more of an art form in some ways. It's still easier to do research on than Freudian psychoanalysis. But Aaron Beck or Albert Ellis's approach might vary a lot from one practitioner to another. but there are many forms of cognitive behavioral therapy that are much more kind of rigid or simple, and they're easier to test. The view from above is literally just a guided visualization exercise, or it can be, so you can write a script and you can record it. Now, that's gold dust in terms of outcome research, because if you have a recording, every single person in your randomized control trial, or whatever type of research study you do, can listen to exactly the same recording. So it's completely standardized, right? If you have 10 psychoanalysts, they're probably doing 10 completely different, things. So how can you measure? Like, one of them works really well, maybe the other one doesn't. Well, they're doing different things, right? But with the view from above, immediately my students were like, why aren't we doing research? Like, because this is perfect for doing outcome research. Literally, you just make a recording of it, like, and get people to listen to it, and then just measure the outcomes at the end of it. Like, listen to this every day for a couple of weeks, and then, at the end of it, we'll get you to fill out a bunch of outcome measures, and so we can quantify the effect that it's had. So we still haven't. There are some people doing research in related areas, but I think there's a lot of potential there for doing more kind of fine-grained research on the view from above. So I would see that as, in some ways, I've just said that it's a simple approach, but it could be like a 20 minutes elaborate script. It's just that it could be held constant. Once you've recorded it, it's one and done, and then you can measure that. But the thing itself could be, there's a lot contained in it. There could be a lot of, imagery, a long 15, 20-minute process, like it's much more immersive and in depth. I think, and then there's also techniques that are less well known in Marcus Aurelius. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I first got involved with Stoicism, the first thing we did was to set up Stoic Week through the Modern Stoicism nonprofit. And that's been running every year for about 12 years now. And it's all based around different Stoic exercises and techniques. And we assumed that when we saw Stoicism taking off as a form of self-help, people are going to practice all these techniques. So it really baffled me that the internet now is awash with podcasts and articles and books about Stoicism. And sometimes I read books about Stoicism as a form of self-help. And I get to the end of it and I think, this book didn't mention any of the actual Stoic practices, or it mentioned 2 of them. But there are roughly 18. So why are these books about applying Stoicism in daily life saying so little about what the Stoics tell us we're supposed to be doing? There's some kind of confusion somewhere along the line that's led people to be, I think, overly vague about what the Stoics prescribe. Marcus Aurelius is pretty clear about it. He will say things like, every day, tell yourself this, or in this situation, literally say this to yourself. Visualize this in your mind's eye frequently, and so on. He's pretty prescriptive about things. And Epictetus is, to some extent, as well. So the view from above, he says he regularly, I think he might even say every day, contemplates his own death, pictures the universe as if seen from high above, or something similar to that. I could pick another technique that people don't talk about much, which is kind of the opposite of the view from above. And there's an early 20th century, there were psychotherapists at the beginning of the 20th century that were explicitly influenced by Stoicism. There was a guy called Paul Dubois, he's a Swiss psychiatrist. He was the leading figure in an approach known as rational psychotherapy. And he was the main rival of Sigmund Freud, but Freud's approach, psychoanalysis, eclipsed rational psychotherapy. Rational psychotherapy had many followers around the world, but it became forgotten about. But Dubois was really into Seneca, and he used to get his clients to read Seneca's letters. And his whole approach is steeped in Stoicism. And his followers were often really into, there's a guy called Baudouin, who was a follower of Dubois, and he was really into Marcus Aurelius, and quotes Marcus Aurelius a lot, and used to teach it to people as a form of psychotherapy and self-help. And so Bauduin says that Marcus has this technique he calls depreciation by analysis. And it involves breaking something down into smaller chunks and then contemplating each little bit in turn. It's like saying if you're facing a problem, you break it down into little bits and deal with one bit at a time. But also we know if something makes someone sad or angry or anxious, they can try breaking it down into pieces and then contemplate doing exposure therapy, for example, or contemplating one fragment of it at a time. So, say you had a cat phobia, you might just picture the paw of a cat. Like, you might picture the tail of a cat. You know, picture the ears of a cat. Like, and you might say, well, I don't really get that anxious if I just picture the paw of a cat. I don't get that anxious if I picture the tail. But when I put it all together, like, maybe it makes me feel more anxious. But if I practice exposing myself to the bits, then when I put them all together, like, often it seems absurd to be anxious about them in combination. Like, it's a way of constructing an exposure hierarchy in a sense. And, we do this in state-of-the-art cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, which has evolved over the last 20 years or so as more recent evidence-based form of therapy. There's a technique called the tin can monster, where it says, you imagine your problem as if it's a great big hulking monster, but it's made of bits of string and tin cans. It's composed, and you can break it down into the individual parts and just face each bit in turn until you get used to it, and then realize that what seemed overwhelming and frightening is really just composed of individual things. And social anxiety, sometimes it helps people. And even in the ancient world, there's a story about Socrates saying this to Alcibiades, actually. That's how old this idea is, that sometimes people are fine speaking to individuals, but they get anxious speaking to an audience. And, for some people, it can be helpful just to think that there's not really any difference speaking to, one person or two people or three people or 300 people. 300 people are just like 300 individuals. If you're speaking to one of them individually, it wouldn't necessarily make you feel anxious. So why should it make you feel anxious? If you're just speaking to 300 individuals, it's just like more of the same, right? But kind of getting used to that, maybe progress. So some people in exposure therapy might imagine, it's for some people, they might just need to visualize speaking to an audience to feel anxious, in which case they might imagine speaking to 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, and that kind of the progressive breaking it down into components can sometimes make it seem easier to manage and make it seem more pointless to feel anxious about it. So Marcus says, he has a very beautiful way of putting this. So Marcus had, like most Roman citizens, he trained in wrestling and pancration, but he also learned dance. Most young men, I think, probably in the ancient world, learned dance. But it was a martial dance. I think actually the best analogy would be, when Marcus was the head of a dance troupe as a young man, and what they did probably could be compared to a kata or a pattern in karate or some other martial art. So it's a kind of stylized version of fighting. So they dressed in armor with shields and spears, and they would leap and bang their shields against their spears and things in time to drums or flutes, and they would do this kind of dance that was based on stylized fighting moves. And it was considered to be kind of morale boosting and stuff, but also as a way of practicing leaping and thrusting with a spear and things like that. So I think it's the ancient European equivalent of doing a kata in karate in a way. And Marcus did that. And he says in the Meditations, if you listen to a piece of music or watch a dance, it can be very evocative emotionally. He could have said, if you listen to a horror story, it might be very evocative emotionally. You watch a movie or read a novel. He says, listening to music or watching dance can seem very evocative. It can seem even overwhelming. But if you break it down into its individual parts, so if you think of each individual note in the music, it becomes meaningless, right? He said, if it's a dance and you think of it broken down into one individual move, at a time, it loses its evocative nature. And he's using this as a metaphor for facing problems. So you could, I guess, a transitional example would be if someone tells you a horror story, it might make the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. But if you just focus on one word of it at a time, like in a kind of stilted way, then it doesn't really evoke anything. You could think of worrying as a horror story you tell yourself about your own future, right? So worrying is evocative if you get really immersed in it. But if you kind of break it down and slow it down and just think of like one word at a time, it's ridiculous to worry in slow motion. Nobody worries in slow motion, right? So you worrying is like a whole story you tell yourself. It's a narrative, but you have to get swept up in it, like watching a movie, right? If you make it stilted and you pause between each bit, it suddenly seems kind of like you get numb to it more easily. Marcus is aware of this as a more nuanced psychological approach, depreciation by analysis or by breaking things down into their elements.
Yeah, because he says he also breaks like wine down into it's just fermented berries. Is that based on the same concept?
I think it's a similar idea. Yeah, like it's a way of viewing things. It's also a way of viewing things more objectively. He's suspending value judgments as well. He's doing something else at the same time. Like he says, he refers to the most expensive wine available, by the way. It's Falernian wine. He says it's just fermented grape juice. And he'd attend all these banquets. He said, this is just a dead goose. This is just a dead cow. Referring to the elaborate meals. Actually, a good example of that would be, I should have written this in my book. I've just thought of a better example. So Hadrian, there was a meal. This is a complete bit of trivia, right? So you can Google this. There's a Roman recipe called the Tetrapharmacon, which means the fourfold remedy. And it's a kind of joke because the Epicureans had a fourfold remedy, which was a kind of their philosophical saying that they had. But there was also a Roman recipe called the Tetrapharmacon, fourfold remedy. And Marcus's adoptive brother was really into it. And so was Emperor Hadrian, if I remember rightly. And it consists of about 4 different meats. So it was pork, something like pork and beef and like goose or something. And the 4th ingredient is really is a good example of how the Romans ate stuff that we wouldn't eat today. This is why you don't see many ancient Roman restaurants, right? The 4th ingredient was a sow's vulva. Like the udder and vulva of a sow, which was a delicacy in Roman cuisine. And the whole thing was baked together and wrapped in pastry. And this was considered a delicacy, like something an emperor would eat, right? So it's this elaborate like pie with 4 meats in it. So you can imagine Marcus looking at something like that, right? And saying, it's just a dead pig, like, a dead cow wrapped in bread and flour, pastry, like, but it's the thing itself is a weird composite, like legendary dish. So there's another famous quote from Napoleon, funnily enough, that looks weirdly like it's derived from Marcus Aurelius, where supposedly Napoleon said a throne is just a bench covered in velvet, which sounds exactly like something Marcus Aurelius would have said.
Yeah, I suppose today that helps with a lot of people are seeing what you should live like on social media. You should have the cool car, the cool clothes. And I guess you can incorporate that same principle into your life, just saying these £1,000 clothes are just a piece of fabric. And I guess that can kind of help in modern day.
I think so. And I think these ideas hit people at a different level. I think one of the main Stoic techniques is contemplation of your own mortality. I think when you're lying, and I'll say something a bit like odd about that. I used to think sometimes when I speak to people, particularly young people, they think of contemplating your mortality as a kind of unusual thing to do sometimes, like a kind of extreme thing to do. But there's something odd about this, which is that there are things that are hidden from us in society. For instance, and I almost imagine one day I can imagine there could be a book. I almost want to call it a book of common sense. And this book could contain information which is easily identifiable, but which is typically forgotten or overlooked or hidden from the majority of people. So one of my favorite examples is the amount of debt that most people are in. Like, so you maybe see somebody with designer clothes and a sports car, right? So you can see this guy's flaunting his wealth. Maybe what you can't see is that he owes tens of thousands of dollars on a credit card, right? So debt is invisible for the most part. But we know, well, you can look up and verify what the average debt is in the country where you live, right? And chronic health problems are invisible. Most people don't realize by the time you reach 50 or 60, I think it's by the time someone's in the mid 50s or 60s, like the majority have at least one chronic health problem. But when you're interacting with other people, that's kind of invisible. Mental health in America, it's about 52% of people have a history of diagnosable mental health problems. But people don't tell you that. Depression is so common that if you're on a bus, there's going to be several people suffering from clinical depression at that time. So these are facts, but they're concealed in a way, because people don't wear a sign in their head saying, I'm clinically depressed and I owe 40 grand in credit cards, right? So you have a distorted perception, and I have Crohn's disease, right? Or something like you have a completely distorted perception of what other people's lives are like, but for the simple reason that people normally keep this stuff private. So you'd have to use your brain and think about it a little bit, but we live at a superficial level. It's almost like we're living in a kind of illusory, like the Matrix. We're living in a sort of illusory world just because, for the simple reason that people just keep a lot of stuff private, right? Now, I guess I'm sensitized to this because I worked as a therapist. So people in therapy would come and tell me about their mental health problems and their physical health problems, and they tell me a lot of private stuff. And I think that this guy is a police inspector, this guy's a bank manager or whatever, and the people he works with have no idea that all the stuff that's going on in his life, right? And if they did, it would probably transform. You meet people, I guarantee you've met people that have been rude to you or abrupt or have acted weird towards you, and you've thought, that guy seems like a jerk. I don't understand why he acted that way. And it may be because he had chronic pain. There's loads of people, especially older people, that have got chronic pain problems, and that can make you cranky, right? But they're not telling you that, so you just think, why was that guy so rude? Why did that guy seem so cranky? And it doesn't excuse the behavior necessarily, but if you knew that his back was absolutely killing him, or he had a splitting headache, you'd probably think, I kind of get now what was going on. It wasn't all about me. It was but all this stuff's hidden from us. Now, another thing that's hidden, I'm thinking of a particular conversation I had with a younger guy once, and it seemed strange to him that people would contemplate their own deaths and so on. I was giving a talk about death once, and I said, put up your hand if you've ever thought that you were going to die, actually. And I think around about half the audience, from what I remember, put their hands up, right? So that could be because you're in an accident, or because you are having surgery or some kind of medical condition. I probably think over the course of my life, maybe 3 or 4 times I thought I was maybe going to die, right? And I hate to break it to you, but by the time you reach 50, it might be that never happens to some people, but I think around about half of people by the time they reach 50, I think, have probably had a health scare or been in an accident or something, and for a split second at least thought, maybe this is it, my time's up, right? So I think contemplation of your death in that sense is more common than people typically realize, especially when you're younger. I mean, some young people have had multiple brushes with death, right? But obviously, as you get older, there's more opportunity for that to have happened to you. And as you get past 50 and 60, then you're bereaved more, like obviously, and your health deteriorates anyway. So, it increases as you towards the end of your life for sure. Like, I mean, if you make it to 70, you probably know a whole bunch of people that have dropped dead before you, right? But when you're like 15, you're not normally. I mean, like my father passed away when I was 14, but most people when they're in their teens and stuff haven't been exposed to that much bereavement or that many brushes with death themselves. Everyone's different. But I mean, you could say the curious thing in some ways is that there are middle-aged people out there that have never had any bereavement or brush with death. And you might think, wow, like I can't imagine like no one that has died, but that's true of some people, right? But this is all private, so we don't see it, And if you're looking at a room full of 20 people, you might think, man, this guy over here has like lost loads of people in his family. He's both his parents, like his wife died, like and this other dude over here's got no idea. He's never experienced anything like that, right? I mean, imagine that was like visible to you, So when we talk about contemplation of death, it's a thing that happens naturally to some people, but not others, And I think what you said about changing our perspective on Falernian wine or a bench, a throne being just a bench covered in velvet. One of the reasons that the Stoics are interested in contemplating death is it can lead to many things. But one of the things it tends to lead to in life in general is a reevaluation of your priorities and values, right? So if you think you're going to die, you're more likely, to look back in your life. And again, not everyone does this. Some people just think, oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh, I'm glad I didn't. And other people think, I nearly died there. Like, and it changes them. Like, and they think, I'm not going to spend as much time playing video games. Or, I feel like, I haven't done anything with my life yet. I mean, lots of people have an epiphany when they have a brush with death. And what does it mean when we say that? We mean that they change their perception of their social status, the importance of certain material possessions. Somebody might have a brush with death and quit their job because they think, I don't really care anymore about like being successful in that career. I'd rather do something more creative or that helps society more. Like, not everyone feels that way, but many people do. So some of the techniques that the Stoics are teaching us, like depreciation by analysis, to some extent happen naturally or are more likely to happen when we encounter a brush with death. And some people never have a brush with death until, they just drop dead one day, right? I mean, it's possible to never have a brush with death. You might just be living merrily, never be bereaved, and then one day you just die peacefully in your sleep. And so you never, and other people are surrounded by death. They maybe, people who do dangerous jobs, like if you're a fireman or you are serving the military, or maybe you do a dangerous sport, you might think, like, there's a whole bunch of times where I thought that my number was up, like, and I was maybe going to die. We associate, in some ways, a number of ancient philosophers with ancient military. Marcus Aurelius obviously was involved in a number of wars. Roman legionaries must have had I really don't think a veteran, like a Roman centurion, must have had a pretty radically different attitude. There's no way that a veteran Roman centurion, if you sat down and had a beer with him, would not have been affected by his exposure to death.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way I can imagine that he would still have the same values that a citizen that just lived in the city and worked as a businessman, never had that kind of a. I mean, these guys were in the hands of fate, like constantly seeing death close up repeatedly. That changes people. And, there were like hundreds of thousands of soldiers serving in the Roman army, and Marcus was surrounded by them. So talking to those guys, definitely. Can you imagine like being in Carnuntum and being surrounded by tens of thousands of Roman soldiers that have been wading through corpses, like that have been standing in front of somebody, like trying to stab them through the heart with a sword on multiple occasions, thinking this might be it. My number could be up. I mean, those guys must have had a very different perspective on life from the majority of us. And so, I think the Stoics, to some extent, are shaped a little bit by their society and the values that some individuals would have developed naturally. And I don't say necessarily. Some people, when they're faced with death, just become more greedy and materialistic and hedonistic as a result. But I think other people, it kind of divides people. Like, you go to one extreme or the other, and other people become much more philosophical, and they start to value things like honor and integrity and these kind of core values a lot more. They want to have self-respect, at least, like, if there's a chance that they might be facing death. At the very least, I want to die kind of feeling that I've lived a life worth living, and I'm proud of the type of person that I am.
Do you agree with Aurelius when he says perfection of character is to live each day as if it were your last, without frenzy, apathy, without pretense? I
think so. Like, I mean, it's also the Stoics are describing something that they believe is archetypal or perennial wisdom. I think Marcus assumes that people would arrive at that conclusion in other societies. And the Stoics know that you get similar ideas in other philosophical traditions and in poetry. They wouldn't be surprised if other, what they would call barbarian cultures had arrived, like us, had arrived at similar ideas. Because they think it's part of human nature. If you look deeply within yourself, any person should arrive at this realization that living each day as if it was your last, in a sense, can help you. I think of it this way. To me, it seems like for a number of reasons, people were born in a society that starts brainwashing us before we learn to speak. And by the time we know how to speak and reason and question things, it's too late. Like, we're already completely entangled in the prevailing values of our society. As Heidegger says, we were thrown into the world. Like, we hit the ground running, right? You're already toddling and speaking. And then by the time you're like maybe 10 years old or something, you start to go, hang on a minute, maybe this is all BS, perhaps, or maybe I'm a bit later. It's too late by then. Like, you've already learned the ways and the values of the society that are completely entrenched in your character. And it's like, like we're all doomed to figure out too late that we're immersed in and shaped by values that aren't really our own. And it's a brush with death, or living each day as if it was your last, that potentially snaps us out of this trance. Even in ancient Greek philosophy, they refer to it as a kind of sleep. Marcus says, you shouldn't talk and act as though you were men asleep. You have to wake up, awaken from the trance of the prevailing values of your society. The Cynics call it typhos, like the smoke, the mist, smoke and mirrors, like of society, the matrix, the illusion, right? But funnily enough, these guys like Andrew Tate and stuff like they seem to me to be exemplars of the matrix. Like, how is the guy who thinks the goal of life is to get as many Bugattis as possible not completely entangled in the matrix? Like, here's a shock, your Bugatti only exists in the Matrix. Like, isn't that obvious? Like, they're outside the Matrix, there are no Bugattis. Like, you're that somebody who thinks that that's what life is all about couldn't be more entrenched in the Matrix. Like, that's obvious. Marcus Aurelius would be like, it's just like a lump of metal. It doesn't, and you're lying on your deathbed, you're not going to think, I'm glad that I bought that fifth Bugatti. Like, nobody in their right mind would think that. They'd think, I kind of wish I'd done something more constructive with my life in general. Or I wish I'd spent more time thinking about what life meant, or just appreciating it more. Like, now that I'm, lying in a hospital bed about to pass away, looking back on it. It is like you look back on your life, and if you get caught up in other people's values, it is almost like you're living in a dream world. And I think you do potentially look back on it and think, I was in a trance. I think for many people, that dream world or that trance or the Matrix is their job. And actually, maybe, in a sense, there's a kind of grain of truth. There's always a grain of truth in sophistry. Like, even in Andrew Tate, there's a kind of little grain of truth, which is that we get. So, of course, society wants you to conform and to, go to school and then go and get a job, right? And you go and you work in a cardboard box factory, like making cardboard boxes, to a high level of precision. If you're lucky, you might get promoted and, you maybe become the manager of the entire cardboard box factory, right? But then you're lying on your deathbed and you look back on it and you think, is that really what life is all about? Like, in some ways it helps society, but really, like, was it really a meaningful and important life? Many careers, I think it's just there's something about human nature that many of the jobs that we have constructed, I think particularly in the modern world, are really about entertainment in a sense, and, are kind of trivial. It serves a function where you have to pay your rent, like, but even in the most limiting environment with the fewest options, so yeah, I think Marcus wants us to kind of snap out of this trance. It's a theme in ancient philosophy. The other cool thing about studying ancient philosophy is we have a great deal in common with the ancient Greeks and Romans, but there are also differences. So for sure, they would, if you really try and imagine, you really try and study Greek philosophy, it encourages you to look at your own society from an external point of view. What would Marcus Aurelius think about having a job flipping burgers, or spending all your money on buying computer games, or, like spending all your time watching TV or arguing with people on the internet? Or, obviously he would just think we're crazy, wouldn't he? Like, he'd be like, why are you guys even doing this stuff? Why do you care? Like, you're distracting yourself. Like, one of the big risks is that people spend their entire life, we risk frittering it away. Entertainment's great, right? But the risk of entertainment is you when it's so available, like, we end up just like squandering all of our lives on trivial forms of entertainment. And then you lie on your deathbed and you look back on it and you think, I don't know, like, I could spend my entire life playing video games or, watching Netflix or something like that. Like, was it worth it? It's kind of fun at the time, but in retrospect, it seems kind of pointless and meaningless, maybe. I didn't actually do anything with my life. And the Stoics want us to snap out of that trance and become more focused on our actions, like, so that we can look back and think, I actually did stuff with my life, at least. Yeah. I don't know what the point of it all is in the grand scheme of things, in a way. Like, life is still a bit of a mystery. I think someone like Marcus Aurelius would say, but for sure, I did my best to do something with it.
Yeah, I think that's good, because I think a lot of people spend their time doom scrolling, and then in reflection they go, I wish I never did this, but then they fall back into the same trap. I realize we've been going on for about almost 3 hours, so I'll try wrap it up. There's normally 2 questions I like to finish off with. One is, what is your personal life philosophy?
Well, basically, I mean, I agree with the Stoics because there are many aspects of Stoicism that seem kind of dated now. But the basic idea that our lives shape our opinion, our opinions shape our quality of life, that in order to understand things, we have to view them in terms of the whole.
Yeah.
I think these are basic truths that are perennial. And, I try to. It's funny when people say things like, I try to live in accord with it. I try to live in accord with it, but more fundamentally, I just think it's true. So I try to remember it and take account of it when I'm living my life.
That's good. And then the last question is, I think you might have a good answer for this, maybe, is especially because you give people practical advice. So is there any advice that you've developed in your own life for yourself that is very niche or unique that maybe you never give people because it's worked for yourself, but you've never thought of sharing it?
I think so. I can't think. I'm not sure if I can think of an example at the moment or not. I feel like often I give people advice about things that I've just figured out over the course of time. Here's one. Actually, I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to jog my memory by thinking that I was speaking to my daughter, who's 12, a few days ago. And I had a conversation with her about manners and saying please and thank you and things like that, and why I think it's important. And it's like my book of common sense, right? So I think it's got to do with the fact that there are things that the real matrix is the distinction between what's public and private, in a sense, and what people just don't tell you, but is sort of obvious. If you are rude to people, so you ask someone a favor, they may just tell you they're too busy, or you're applying for a job or some work opportunity or promotion or something, but you're just kind of like rude or abrasive. It's unlikely that people will say, you didn't get this promotion because because of your manners, right? It's unlikely anyone's going to tell you, I was thinking about doing this favor for somebody, but I didn't do it to you because you seem like a bit of a jerk, right? People usually just don't tell you. So it's secret, it's private, it's hidden from you. You'll just go through life thinking, I wonder why I don't get more opportunities, right? And you'll never know. You'll die not knowing that it's just because the way you spoke to people. If you're in a position where you can do favors for people, it's more obvious. So if you're an employer or as an author, people ask me for advice all the time. I'm amazed, especially with the internet. Some people will message me and they'll go, hey, dude, like, how do I become as successful as you? And then they'll be maybe a bit chippy about the way they ask. And I'll usually reply to them anyway. But if somebody's more polite, and they say, hey, I hope you don't mind me asking you a question out of the blue. It's really important to me, and I thought perhaps you could help me. So if you don't mind, I'm probably more likely to spend more time giving them help, right? This is just the way that society works. But the thing is, people won't tell you. No one's going to say, I'm not going to put as much effort into helping you because, you don't seem to be exhibiting good manners, or you're not asking me very politely. Also, you might email somebody or message them, and if you're just kind of abrasive or blunt about it, they might just never respond, right? So I said to my daughter, it's easy to underestimate the value of good manners because it's not, it's hidden beneath the surface. You just die not knowing how many people passed you over, or ignored you, like, because of the way that you spoke to them. And so it always surprises me when people are kind of rude or chippy, It's like, I think it's not that it upsets me so much as I kind of think, do you go through life talking to other people like that? And then you probably wonder why you're not more successful. And like, it would be so easy for you just to say please and thank you. And doing that alone throughout the course of your entire life would probably take things in a slightly different direction. So that's a piece of advice that I give my daughter. It's an illusion, like it's a trick, that you don't see the consequences sometimes of the way that you speak to people, but just kind of being more grateful. Another one is when someone does you a favor and you're not grateful to them, then that leaves them thinking, I don't know if it's worth helping this guy again. He didn't seem, didn't seem that important to him. But if you are very thankful and grateful, even if you can't actually repay them, if you just go, oh man, that meant so much to me, you've got no idea, it was like a huge help to me, like, what you did, then that person kind of feels reinforced and they want to help you again. But, if you don't express gratitude to other people for the things they do, the truth is they're probably not going to help you again in the future. Like, and then your whole life is going to end up going in a different direction. Like, just because you didn't say thank you properly to people. Like, so I really think the things that would help people the most often are really simple things. Like, I've spoken to some of the young guys I've spoken to in particular, I can think of, that are really into Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and stuff like that, but then approach me in a really kind of like chippy way. And I sort of think, I don't know, like the advice that these guys are giving you or whatever it is that you're getting, like, but it seems obvious to me that you're running into problems because you just lack basic manners. Like, and that's going to affect all of your relationships throughout the whole course of your life. And it would be so easy to fix, right? So it might seem like an odd piece of advice, but there are many things that really affect people that are simple, like, and super easy to fix. We've talked about exposure therapy, we've talked about the view from above, we've talked about cognitive distancing. Those are kind of relatively simple things, and they can help people a lot, but there's other, like, really, really, really simple things that people just tend not to do. The big mistakes that people make in life, I think, are often tiny, simplistic things, and then really just good parenting in many cases would have taught people, that I teach my daughter, for example, I say, don't say thank you, like, say thank you very much, right? It's easy, just say thank you very much. Like, try and remind yourself to do that. Just go slightly further, like, than the easiest, laziest possible option. And then maybe, and sometimes you want to go a little bit further in expressing gratitude, but at least say thank you very much to people, like, when you're thanking them. That's easy. Any idiot can do that, right? But it can, like, just changing things very slightly like that can make quite a big difference. When people say, how are you, right? Don't say fair to middling. Or, okay, my friend, when I was a young guy, one of my mentors was a famous hypnotist called Gil Boyne. And he was from California, but he lived in London. I used to hang out with Gil. When people said to Gil, how are you? He'd say, wonderful. And he said, watch this, right? He'd be in a shop and someone would say, good morning, how are you? He'd say, I'm wonderful. Like, and they'd look at him like he was crazy for a second. And then they say, really? Wow. Like, how come? And then he'd say, oh, because today, this happened or that happened. Or he'd get in a conversation about positive things. And it would change the whole tenor of the conversation, right? Just the very fact that he always said, I'm wonderful. And he goes, I can always come up with a reason, and it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation. He goes, I just don't say, he goes, I realized every single time I speak to somebody, pretty much, they say, how are you? And people go, not bad. Like, and he goes, I just wanted to break out of that trance, like, and say something different. And you can see the main thing is that the other person suddenly seems like they've snapped out of a trance. They're not on autopilot anymore. And you're having a different sort of conversation. Yeah. And I watched Gil doing that, and I thought, he's right. Like, he's now having more meaningful conversations with 90% of the people that he speaks to, just on a daily basis. Otherwise, it's like listening to two robots talking.
Yeah, I love that advice, actually. But it's kind of like we live on a surface level. I don't know if this is a universal thing, but at least where I'm from, the extent you go to talking to someone is saying, all right. So you say, all right, they say, all right back. And that is it. And yeah, it's just very like, there's no need for that. If that's all you're going to do, it doesn't do much. But I do actually really like that advice about manners. Because I've never thought about that like that. I notice when people are rude, and it's kind of like I don't consciously keep a tally, but there's some thing in the back of my mind remembering that they were rude. And
it doesn't make you want to help them.
Yeah,
in
exactly,
the future.
Yeah. I guess that it's kind of, it's like a mark on their name. And I guess other people will be looking at you that way as well, and keeping those marks. So I think that's wonderful advice.
Well, thank you very much.
Donald Robertson has made me think a lot about the way I've been teaching. He's made me think a lot about the things I've been learning and where I should be putting my energy and how I should be trying to help others, which is good. It's all brilliant. I think he's a very good mentor. I wish I spoke to him sooner. I wish I could speak to him like once a week to just like refresh. But I think his advice is amazing and very practical. It's really good stuff. So I hope you enjoyed today's talk with Donald Robertson. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Remember, my book, The Everyday Stoic, Simple Rules for a Good Life, is now available on Amazon and all good bookstores. Please feel free to leave a review, as I'm loving reading these new reviews. Donald Robertson's Marcus Aurelius, The Stoic Emperor, his book, I haven't read it yet, but if I'm going to base it off of Donald's previous books, I would say it'll be one of my favorites. Honestly, these books right here, I got them for my talk with Donald, but I never used them. These books, I know this is massively popular, but these two have been two of my favorite books of all time. And I've actually, is it this one? I've got so many little, I don't know if you can see them. I mean, I haven't made as much notes as I do with this, but I haven't had this as long. I've left so many little notes in here because it's just so full of amazing wisdom. So I'm telling you, buy Donald Robertson's books. Donald Robertson is the person I always look towards. If I'm learning something new, if I want to hear a podcast, I always just type his name in because his knowledge is amazing. So go show Donald some love. If you go over to his Instagram or something, let him know where you came from. That would be much appreciated. I think he deserves, I don't know if he even wants it, but he deserves so much more followers, so much more. I know he's got a huge fan base of loyal readers, but I'm sure there's so many people, younger people, that can benefit from his stuff that maybe aren't benefiting from it because they're not seeing it out there. So head over to his stuff and know it's life-changing. It's life-changing. It really is life-changing, actually. That's not an exaggeration. I'm actually not exaggerating. His books are life-changing. His podcasts are life-changing. Today's talk with him changed my life. I hope it changed your life. Honestly, I'm blown away. So, just a quick word for our sponsor, Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. If you have any interest in Huel products, click the link in the description. And all of you, if you want to continue to flourish in your life, it's a long process. You don't just listen to one podcast and start to flourish. I'll give it 40 episodes. Listen to 40 episodes. I'm only on my 12th episode. Listen to 40 episodes and you'll start to flourish. That's an estimate that's probably wrong. I don't know. But the idea is everyone deserves to flourish, and we only do that through constant progress, working on ourselves, learning these things. And subscribe to the Spotify, subscribe to YouTube, follow me on Instagram at William Mulligan Brother, at The Everyday Stoic. Check out my book. I think it's one of the best entries into Stoicism. Probably, I don't know, maybe bias. It's just a practical guide in Stoicism, how to understand it, how to use it in your life, just as I did from being who I was to becoming who I am now. I wasn't very happy. I was very sad, very lost, very anxious. Now I don't feel any of these things. And I put it down to the journey in this book. So thank you for listening and have a great day.